Hello, Night Seekers. Welcome to Black Screen Horror. Relax, close your eyes, and enjoy tonight's true scary stories with gentle rain. If you enjoy the journey, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Sweet dreams, if you dare. I grew up in a house built in 1809. My parents bought it after the previous owner, a woman who was 89 years old at the time, passed away. The house had been sitting empty for a little while after her death, waiting for the right family to come along and take it on, and my parents fell in love with it almost the moment they walked through the front door. It really was a beautiful house, the kind of old, solid building you don't see much anymore, with thick walls and creaking wood floors and a history that seemed to hang in the air of every room. But from the very beginning, even before I fully understood what that uneasy feeling meant, the basement and my bedroom always made me feel uncomfortable in a way I couldn't quite explain to anyone, not even to myself. I don't recall exactly when I started feeling and seeing things, but I know I was quite young enough that at first I didn't really understand there was anything unusual about it at all. Young enough that I simply accepted these strange experiences as part of what it meant to live in that particular house. The same way you accept the creak of a particular stair, or the way a certain door always sticks a little in the frame. Kids are like that sometimes. They don't always know what's normal and what isn't, especially when the strange things have been present for as long as they can remember. The closet in my bedroom was always extremely cold, noticeably colder than the rest of the room. A kind of cold that didn't match the temperature anywhere else in the house, no matter the season or how the heating was set. And it almost smelled like a strong perfume, something old-fashioned and floral, the kind of scent you might associate with an older woman's dressing table, thick and cloying in a way that lingered even after you closed the closet door and walked away from it. I remember standing in my room some nights, staring at that closet door, feeling that cold seep out from underneath it, catching that strange perfume smell drifting into the room, and not fully understanding why it made my stomach twist with unease the way it did. The door itself would often close and open on its own, slowly, without any draft or breeze that could explain it, swinging just enough to make a small sound before settling again, sometimes open, sometimes shut, seemingly at its own will rather than anything I did. I felt someone sitting on the edge of my bed some nights, a distinct pressure and weight pressing down into the mattress beside me, as real and physical as if an actual person had sat down there. Though, whenever I worked up the courage to look, there was never anyone visible at all. And more than that specific sensation, I felt like someone was watching me as I slept. A persistent awareness that stayed with me through many nights of my childhood. The kind of feeling that makes the back of your neck prickle even when your eyes are closed, and you're trying desperately to convince yourself you're only imagining it. Then the smells in the house started spreading beyond just my bedroom closet. My parents often left my brother and I on our own during the day, since we were old enough by then to be trusted at home without supervision for a few hours at a time, and it was during those quieter afternoons, when the house was mostly silent except for the two of us, that I started to notice a smell moving through certain areas of the house, not staying confined to my closet the way it had before. There was a window on the stairs that overlooked our neighborhood, a spot I passed multiple times a day going up and down between floors, and it used to smell like what I would describe, in my child's vocabulary at the time, as grandma perfume. That same thick floral scent I associated with the closet, but now appearing in this completely different part of the house entirely. Often the smell would move around like someone was walking around the house with it, drifting from the stairwell into the hallway, then fading, then reappearing somewhere else entirely, following no logical pattern I could trace to any open window or draft. And it always came paired with an extreme cold area, a patch of chilled air that would follow the scent as it moved, as if whatever was carrying that perfume smell was also carrying its own personal pocket of winter along with it, regardless of the actual temperature in the rest of the house. Things moved without anyone touching them during this period, too. Small shifts that were easy to dismiss individually, but added up over time into something harder to explain away. Items would go missing entirely, sometimes for days, only to turn up later in peculiar places, tucked into spots we knew for certain we hadn't left them, as if someone had picked them up and set them down somewhere else entirely while none of us were looking. That was the main floor of the house, that particular collection of unsettling but almost manageable experiences. The kind of thing you could tell yourself was just an old house, being an old house, full of drafts and creaks and misplaced items that any family might chalk up to ordinary forgetfulness. The basement was another story entirely, in every sense of that phrase. I was horrified of this area of the house from as early as I can remember. A fear that went deeper and felt more instinctive than anything I experienced upstairs. In older homes like ours, the basements are usually dirt floor, with rough cement walls that never got properly finished the way basements in newer houses often are, cold and damp and dimly lit, no matter how many light bulbs you installed down there. The stairs leading down to the basement were old and open-backed, meaning you could see straight through the gaps beneath each step down into the darkness underneath the staircase itself. A design that always made my skin crawl every single time I had to use those stairs. Anytime I had to go down there, for whatever reason, I ran or asked someone to come with me, refusing point blank to descend those stairs alone if I could possibly avoid it. I don't recall anything specific really happening down there during those early years. No distinct event I could point to and describe in detail. Just an uneasy, scared feeling that clung to that whole space and refused to let go. A persistent sense of being somewhere I fundamentally wasn't wanted. Until we renovated the basement when I was 14 years old, and everything changed into something far more direct and frightening. Going back to talk about my bedroom for a moment, I hated sleeping in it for all those years leading up to the renovation, because of how cold it always seemed to be regardless of the season, because of that closet and its strange perfume smell, because of the feeling of being watched that never fully went away, no matter how many nights passed without anything dramatic actually happening. My parents, perhaps sensing some of my discomfort, even if I never fully articulated the reasons behind it, decided to renovate the basement so that I could have a bigger room down there instead, thinking it would be an upgrade. A bit of extra space and privacy that a growing teenager might appreciate. Great. I remember thinking sarcastically at the time, moving my things down into that same basement I had spent years being terrified of, though I told myself that a proper renovation, fresh paint, new flooring, better lighting, might finally make it feel like an ordinary room instead of the dark, uneasy space it had always been to me. I moved my room down there, and for a while, everything was genuinely okay. The fresh renovations did make a difference, at least on the surface, giving the space a more modern, lived-in feeling that helped push back some of my old fear. But that relief didn't last as long as I'd hoped. I often felt like a man was watching me while I was down there, a distinctly different presence than whatever I had sensed in my old upstairs bedroom, more masculine somehow, more deliberate in its attention. Or you would see a shadow shift at the edge of your vision and turn around quickly to see who was there, and obviously, every single time, there was nothing. Just the empty basement room around you, silent and still. Then, the pounding started. Late at night, it almost sounded like someone hitting on the wall from the inside, from somewhere within the structure of the wall itself, rather than from another room or from outside the house. It would start slow and quiet, a few isolated knocks spaced apart, and then build up gradually into a full pounding, urgent and rhythmic, loud enough to be genuinely alarming. Loud enough that I would lie frozen in my bed listening to it. too scared to get up and investigate, too scared to do much of anything except wait for it to eventually stop, which it always did, eventually, leaving behind a silence that felt just as heavy as the pounding itself had been. Then came the watching, which somehow felt even worse than the pounding despite being quieter and less dramatic. I always felt like someone was standing right behind me, close enough that I could almost sense their presence physically, like a dark shadow looming just behind my shoulder no matter which direction I happened to be facing. I never slept that well during this entire period of my life. Always scared, always tense, my body never fully able to relax into proper rest, even on nights when nothing overtly frightening seemed to be happening. I went into a really deep depression during this stretch of time. A heavy, exhausting sadness that I now understand was almost certainly connected to how constantly unsafe and unsettled I felt in my own home. Though at the time I mostly just experienced it as an overwhelming tiredness and sadness I couldn't shake. I hardly left the basement during that period, retreating into myself in a way that worried the people around me, though I don't think any of us fully connected it back to the house itself at the time. One night, I was home alone, my parents out somewhere and my brother not yet back, and I went upstairs to get a drink of water from the kitchen. There was a back porch attached to that part of the house, with a glass door leading out onto it. It was winter at the time, and the porch itself was cold enough that condensation had built up on the inside of that glass door. A light misty film covering the surface the way it does when warm indoor air meets cold glass. As I walked up the stairs toward the kitchen, moving past that glass door, two handprints appeared on it, pressed clearly into the condensation from what would have had to be the inside of the porch, and a breath mark appeared beside them, and then slowly faded away. The unmistakable circular fog of someone exhaling against cold glass, appearing and disappearing right in front of my eyes with no one standing anywhere near that door to have made it. The dark man, as I had started calling him in my own head over the previous months, was watching me. I was literally paralyzed with fear in that moment, unable to move, unable to look away, staring at that door and those slowly fading handprints, almost as if I physically couldn't stop myself, for at least a few full minutes. My whole body locked in place by a fear more intense than anything I had experienced up to that point in my entire life. Eventually, whatever held me there released its grip enough for me to move again, and I ran outside immediately, not stopping to grab a coat or shoes, and slept on the front porch that night, curled up in the cold rather than spend another minute inside that house, until my brother finally got home the next morning and found me there, confused and worried by what he saw. I get shivers thinking about this memory even now, all these years later, the clarity of it never having faded the way so many other childhood memories eventually do. I was about 15 years old at the time this happened, and I moved out of the house about 7 months later to attend college early, at just 16 years old, younger than most students starting that chapter of their lives. I did anything I could to move away from that house as quickly as possible, pushing myself academically and emotionally in ways I probably wouldn't have otherwise, simply because the idea of continuing to live inside those walls felt unbearable to me by that point. As something of a postscript to all of this, my mom later divorced my dad, and not too long after that, they sold the house entirely, closing that particular chapter of our family's history for good. They later told me, once enough time had passed, that these conversations felt possible, that the elderly lady who had owned the house before them had actually passed away in what became my old bedroom upstairs. The same room with the cold closet and the perfume smell and the persistent feeling of being watched that I had experienced for so many years without ever knowing why. Additionally, her husband had suffered some kind of accident down in the basement at some point during their time living there, though no one in the family ever specified exactly what that accident actually was, only that it had happened, and that by most accounts he had not been a kind man to his wife during their marriage. A detail that has stuck with me and made a certain uncomfortable sense out of everything I experienced in both those spaces over the years. My parents only started genuinely believing that the house was haunted after the things I had described to them over the years apparently got noticeably worse after I moved out. Experiences my brother and later my parents themselves began having, once I was no longer there to serve, I suppose, as whatever kind of focus the house's presence had originally directed itself toward. I have heard stories, secondhand through family friends and old neighbors who kept in occasional contact, that the new owners who bought the house after my parents sold it have had things thrown at them inexplicably. Pictures falling off the walls without any obvious cause, and those same sickly sweet perfume smells paired with sudden cold spots following them through certain rooms. The exact same pattern of experiences that had haunted my own childhood in that house so many years earlier. I have yet to step foot back in that house since the day I left it as a terrified 15-year-old sleeping on the front porch rather than face whatever was waiting for me inside. And I don't think I ever will, no matter how much time passes or how far removed I become from that period of my life. No one in my family talks about it much these days, or fully admits that any of it happened the way I remember it happening, my parents included, as if the whole subject has quietly been agreed upon as something better left unexamined, tucked away and left behind along with the house itself. But I know what I experienced. I know what I saw on that glass door that winter night. And I know what it felt like to be a teenager lying frozen in my own bed, convinced that something was standing right behind me in the dark, and no amount of time or distance has ever been enough to make me doubt any of it. Sometimes, even now as an adult, with a home of my own, far removed from that house built in 1809, and everything that happened inside it, I will catch myself checking a closet a little too carefully before closing the door, or pausing at the top of a staircase for just a second longer than necessary. Some old instinct still quietly alert, even after all these years. I don't think that particular kind of fear ever fully leaves you once it's been planted that deeply in childhood. It simply settles somewhere in the back of your mind. Quiet, most of the time, but never entirely gone. Ready to resurface the moment something reminds you of cold closets, strange perfume, and a dark shape standing patiently behind your shoulder, waiting for you to turn around. Looking back on it now, from the distance of adulthood, I have spent a lot of time trying to piece together the shape of what actually happened in that house across all those years. The way you try to fit together fragments of something much bigger than any single memory can hold on its own. The elderly woman who died in my bedroom, the husband who was, by every account, passed down to me. Unkind to her during their marriage, the accident he supposedly had in the basement that nobody in my family ever fully explained, all of it forms a kind of quiet, unsettling shape once you lay the pieces out next to each other. I have wondered more than once whether the presence I always associated with the cold and the perfume upstairs was her, lingering in the space where she passed. And whether the dark man I felt so strongly downstairs, the one who pounded on the walls and stood behind me in the dark, whether that presence was somehow connected to whatever happened to her husband in that basement, the accident nobody would name. I have no way of confirming any of this, of course. It is simply the story I have built for myself over the years. A way of making some kind of sense out of experiences that otherwise resist any tidy explanation. My parents, on the rare occasions the subject comes up at all anymore, tend to deflect quickly, changing the topic or offering vague, non-committal responses that make it clear they would rather not revisit that particular chapter of our family's history, in any real detail. My brother remembers pieces of it too, though his memories differ slightly from mine in certain details, the way memories often do between siblings who live through the same events from slightly different vantage points. He remembers the cold spots more than the smells. He remembers hearing footsteps on the stairs at night when he knew for certain both our parents were already asleep in their own room. Sometimes I think about writing to the current owners of that house, whoever they might be by now, the family after mine, just to ask, gently, whether they have experienced anything themselves, whether the smells and the cold and the sense of being watched have continued on in the years since I left. I never have, and I don't think I ever will. Some part of me is afraid of what the answer might be, and an even larger part of me suspects that reaching out, opening that door again even from a distance, might invite something back into my life that I have worked very hard over the years to keep firmly behind me. The house still stands, as far as I know, over 200 years old now, carrying inside its walls whatever it has always carried, whatever passed between that elderly couple long before my family ever arrived to unknowingly inherit it. I hope, for whoever lives there now, that they have found some peace within those walls that I never quite managed to find myself. But I don't expect that hope to be true. Not really. Not given everything I lived through inside that house, and not given the stories that have continued to drift back to me secondhand, long after I thought I had finally left it all behind for good. There is one more detail I have never quite been able to shake, something I only remembered clearly years after leaving, when a friend of mine happened to ask what the previous owners had actually looked like, whether I had ever seen a photograph of them, whether I could put a face to the presence I had spent so many years feeling, but never truly seeing. I realized, answering her question, that I actually had seen a photograph once, tucked into a box of things left behind in the attic that my parents found shortly after we moved in, back before any of this had really started. Back when the house was still simply an old house to us rather than something to be afraid of. It was a formal portrait, the kind people used to have taken in studios decades ago. The elderly woman standing slightly in front of a taller man, his hand resting on her shoulder in a way that in the photograph looked almost gentle, almost affectionate. Nothing at all like the picture painted by what my parents later told me about their marriage. I remember staring at that photograph for a long moment as a child, feeling an odd chill run through me even then, long before I understood why, and then setting it back into its box without really thinking much more about it at the time. I wish now that I had asked more questions back then, while my parents still owned the house, while there might have been more people around who remembered the couple who lived there before us. Neighbors who might have known them personally. Records that might have explained more clearly what actually happened in that basement all those years earlier. But I was a child for most of that time, and then a frightened teenager desperate only to leave. And by the time I was old enough and far enough removed to actually want real answers, most of those threads had already gone quiet. The neighbors moved away or passed on themselves. The house sold and resold. The details growing hazier with each passing year rather than clearer. What I am left with, in the end, is simply the memory itself, sharp and unresolved. A childhood spent in a beautiful old house that never once, in all the years I lived there, felt entirely like it belonged to my family, rather than to whoever had come before us. I carry that memory with me still, quietly, the way you carry any old wound that is healed on the surface, but never fully stopped aching underneath. And every so often, usually late at night, usually when the house around me is quiet enough for old memories to surface unbidden, I find myself thinking about that dark shape standing behind my shoulder in the basement, about those two handprints fading slowly on a cold glass door, and I wonder, not for the first time, whether some part of him is still down there in the dark, waiting, patient as ever, for someone new to finally turn around and see him standing there. Even now, when I picture that basement in my mind, the dirt floor, the open back stairs, the cold that never seemed to fully leave no matter how much we renovated, I still feel that same old tightening in my chest, the same instinct to look over my shoulder just to be sure. I have built a life far away from that house since then, in places that feel warm and safe and entirely my own. And yet some small part of that 15-year-old girl sleeping alone on a freezing front porch has never quite stopped waiting for morning to come. My sister had been talking about it for almost 2 weeks straight before Halloween even got close. She and her friends kept whispering about some old house out past the edge of town, a place people said was haunted, a place with a name that seemed to change depending on who was telling the story. Some called it the Miller Place. Others just called it the house on Route 9. A few kids at her school swore it had a completely different name altogether, something older, something that sounded like it belonged to a family nobody could remember anymore. Nobody seemed totally sure who used to live there or what happened to them, but everyone agreed on one thing. Something bad had gone on inside those walls, and something bad was still there, waiting, the way old houses sometimes seem to wait for the right person to walk through their door. I wasn't the type to believe in ghost stories. Not really. I liked the idea of them, the goosebumps, the little shiver down your spine when someone tells a good one around a fire with the lights turned low. But actually believing that a house could hold on to something, that walls and floorboards could remember pain and anger and fear the way a person does, that always felt like a stretch to me. I'd grown up watching horror movies with my sister, the two of us curled up on the couch with a bowl of popcorn between us, screaming at the screen and laughing right after. And somewhere along the way, I think I'd convinced myself that fear was just a kind of entertainment, something you could turn off the second the credits rolled. Still, when my sister asked if I would drive her and her two friends out there on Halloween night, I said yes without much thought. It was Halloween. It was supposed to be a little scary. That was the whole point of the night, wasn't it? A little thrill, a little scare, something to talk about at school the next day. The four of us piled into my car a little after 9 at night. My sister sat up front with me, and her friends, two girls I'll just call Jenna and Priya, since those weren't quite their real names, but close enough, sat in the back seat, already giggling about nothing, the way teenagers do when they're nervous and trying to cover it up with laughter. There was a kind of electric energy in the car, that specific Halloween feeling where the whole world seems to lean a little closer to the strange and the unexplained, where every shadow looks a bit longer than it should, and every sound outside the window seems to carry a little more weight than it would on any other night of the year. The night was cold in that specific autumn way, where the air feels thin and sharp, like it might crack if you breathed too hard. Fog was starting to settle low over the fields as we left the streetlights of town behind us and turned onto the county road that would take us out to where the house was supposed to be. My sister had the radio on low, some playlist she'd made specifically for the drive, full of old spooky songs and a few tracks that were really just there for the mood rather than for actually listening to. Jenna and Priya kept whispering back and forth in the back seat, half telling each other rumors about the house, half trying to scare each other with made-up details neither of them could confirm. My sister had gotten the directions from a boy in her class, who had gotten them from his older cousin, who claimed to have actually walked up to the porch once on a dare and touched the front door before running back to his car so fast he'd tripped over the porch steps and scraped his knee on the way down. The story had been passed around enough times that none of us were sure how much of it was true anymore. But the directions themselves seemed simple enough. Drive out past the old grain silo. Follow the road until the pavement turns to gravel, and the house would be on the left, set back behind a line of dead oak trees with a long dirt driveway leading up to it. My sister had written it all down on a sticky note, stuck to the dashboard, just in case her phone lost signal out that far from town, which out here was more likely than not. We found the grain silo easily enough, its metal sides rusted and dull in my headlights, standing tall and lonely against the dark sky like some kind of forgotten monument. The gravel started right where it was supposed to. The smooth hum of the tires on pavement replaced by a rougher, crunchier sound as we made the turn. I slowed the car down, watching for the line of oak trees, watching for any sign of a driveway or a rooftop against the dark sky. My sister had her phone out, the little flashlight app on. Aiming it out the window like that would somehow help her see further than the headlights already did, though none of us said anything about how pointless that probably was. And then there it was. Or rather, there it wasn't. We came around a slow bend in the road, and the trees opened up into a wide, flat, empty field. No house, no driveway, no broken fence or collapsed porch steps, nothing. Just tall, dead grass, swaying a little in the wind, silver under the moonlight, stretching back toward a tree line that seemed impossibly far away for what should have been a big two-story house sitting right there in the middle of it. I slowed the car down almost to a stop, leaning forward over the steering wheel, squinting through the windshield like maybe I was simply looking in the wrong spot, like the house might be hiding just beyond the edge of what my headlights could reach. "This can't be it," Priya said from the back seat, leaning forward between the two front seats to get a better look, her breath fogging up a little patch of the window glass. Maybe we passed it. I pulled the car over onto the shoulder, gravel crunching under the tires, and we all sat there for a second, looking out at the empty field like it might rearrange itself if we stared hard enough at it. Like somehow the house would simply shimmer into view if we just gave it enough attention. My sister checked her phone again, scrolling back through the texted directions, double-checking the mile marker, the mention of the grain silo, all of it lining up exactly with where we were parked. There was no house. There wasn't even the shape of a foundation in the grass. No broken bricks, no pile of collapsed wood, nothing that would suggest a building had ever stood there at all. It was as if the field had simply always been a field, empty and undisturbed, without so much as a single sign that anything man-made had ever touched it. Maybe the address was wrong, Jenna offered, though she didn't sound convinced by her own words, her voice thin against the quiet hum of the idling engine. Or maybe it burned down or got torn down and nobody updated the story. That happens sometimes, right? People keep telling the same old story even after the place is gone. That seemed reasonable enough at the time, so I pulled back onto the road and we kept driving, figuring maybe the house was further down, past where we'd assumed it would be. Maybe the boys' directions had simply been a little off. A mile marker misremembered, or a turn described wrong. The gravel road kept curving through the dark, the fog getting thicker the further we went, curling low across the road in patches that caught in my headlights like something breathing, like the whole field was slowly exhaling a long, cold breath across the road ahead of us. The trees along the roadside grew closer together for a stretch, their bare branches forming a kind of broken tunnel overhead, and for a moment the car felt smaller, quieter. The four of us pressed a little closer together by the narrowing dark around us. After another mile or so, my headlights caught something ahead that made me slow down even more. Police tape, the yellow and black kind, stretched across two orange traffic barrels, blocking the road. The tape fluttered weakly in the breeze, one end of it torn loose and dragging along the gravel, and for a second, none of us said anything at all. just staring ahead at this unexpected obstacle in a night that already felt like it was accumulating too many unexplained things. I stopped the car and rolled down my window a little, though there wasn't a single other car or person in sight to ask about it. Past the barrels, I could just make out where the road dipped down toward a low spot, and beyond that, nothing. No bridge. Just a gap where the road clearly used to continue, now replaced by a dark space I couldn't fully see the bottom of. It looked like water damage, maybe a flood from the recent storms we'd had that fall. The kind of thing that could easily wash out an old bridge on a back county road like this one. I could hear the faint sound of water somewhere down in that gap, a slow trickling sound that seemed almost too quiet for how much damage had apparently been done to the road. Well, that settles it, I said, trying to sound more casual than I felt, forcing a small laugh into my voice that didn't quite land the way I wanted it to. We're not getting through this way. We should just turn around and head back. There was a general murmur of agreement from the back seat, though I noticed nobody seemed all that eager to keep looking for the house anymore anyway. The fun, spooky energy from earlier in the drive had quieted down into something more like unease, the kind that settles into a car when everyone silently agrees something feels off, but nobody wants to be the first one to say it out loud and risk sounding foolish in front of the others. Even the radio, still playing low in the background, seemed to be filling the silence rather than adding to the mood the way it had earlier. I found a wide enough spot in the gravel to turn the car around, the headlights sweeping across the dead grass and fog as I did, the beams briefly illuminating stretches of empty field on either side of the road before swinging back toward the direction we'd come from. We started heading back the way we came, back past the spot where the house should have been, back toward the grain silo and the paved road that would lead us home. Nobody talked much during this part of the drive. My sister kept glancing at her phone, though I noticed she wasn't actually looking at anything on the screen, just holding it, the way people sometimes do when they need something familiar to hold on to. As we approached that same open field again, I found myself easing off the gas, without really meaning to. Something about the field bothered me more on the way back than it had the first time we passed it, though I couldn't have told you exactly why. Maybe it was some instinct I wasn't fully aware of, some part of my brain that had noticed something the rest of me hadn't quite processed yet. My headlights swept across the tall grass, and for just a second, right at the edge of the beam, I caught a flash of something. A reflection, sharp and bright, gone as quick as it appeared, the way light catches off glass and then vanishes the moment the angle shifts, even slightly. Did you guys see that? I asked, already slowing the car down further, my foot easing off the gas until we were barely crawling along the gravel. See what? My sister asked, sitting up straighter in her seat, her attention snapping fully away from her phone now. I eased the car to a stop right along the shoulder, right about where we'd stopped the first time, and I angled the headlights out toward the field. For a long moment, nothing, just grass and fog and darkness, the wind moving softly through the tall dead stalks, bending them slightly one direction and then another. And then, as the fog shifted slightly with the breeze, there it was again, two flashes of reflected light, low to the ground, spaced apart just far enough to look like windows. I sat forward, squinting through the windshield, and slowly the shape started to become clear. A house. A big two-story house, dark and weathered, sitting right there in the middle of the field, exactly where it should have been the whole time, as if it had simply been waiting for us to look at it properly. Nobody in the car said anything for a moment. We all just stared. The house looked old, older than I would have guessed from the directions, with a sagging porch roof and windows that seemed to swallow the headlight beams rather than simply reflect them back at us. The wood siding looked gray and weathered, streaked in places with something darker that could have been mold or could have been age or could have been something neither of us wanted to think too hard about. It wasn't hidden by trees or bushes or any obstruction I could point to. It was just sitting there in an open field, in plain view, and yet somehow, none of us had noticed it either time we'd driven past just minutes earlier, when the field had appeared as flat and empty as any ordinary stretch of farmland. How did we miss that? Jenna said quietly, her voice smaller than it had been all night, almost swallowed up by the low hum of the engine. That's not something you just miss. That's a whole house. That's a huge house. Maybe it was the fog, Priya said, though she didn't sound like she believed it either, her voice wavering slightly on the last word. The fog had been thick, sure, but not thick enough to completely hide something that size. Not when we'd been driving slow enough and close enough to see individual blades of grass swaying in our headlights just minutes before. My sister hadn't said a word in almost a full minute, which for her was unusual enough on its own, since she was usually the one filling any silence with something to say. She was just staring out the window at the house, her flashlight app long forgotten. The phone resting forgotten in her lap, its little light still glowing uselessly against her jeans. I followed her gaze back to the house and found myself doing the same thing. Just staring, trying to make sense of how something so large could simply not have been there, and then suddenly be there, all without a single explanation that made any sense to any of us. We sat like that for what felt like a long time, but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes. The engine idling, the headlights holding steady on the dark shape of the house across the field. Nobody suggested getting out to look closer. Nobody suggested walking up to the porch to touch the door the way that boy's cousin supposedly had. Whatever bravado we'd had earlier in the night, whatever spooky Halloween energy had gotten us out here in the first place, had drained completely out of the car, replaced by something quieter and much less fun. Something that sat heavy in my chest and made my hands feel a little too tight around the steering wheel. It was Priya who finally saw it first, her voice cutting through the silence with a sharpness that made all of us jump in our seats. There's a car behind us. I glanced up at my rearview mirror, and sure enough, there were headlights approaching from behind. Still a good distance back, but closing steadily. 2 small points of light growing slowly larger against the darkness of the road. My first thought was relief, honestly. The simple human comfort of knowing we weren't the only people out on this stretch of road in the middle of the night. Maybe it was someone local, someone who could tell us what was actually going on with this house, why it had seemed to vanish and reappear, why the directions we'd been given led us to what should have been an empty field just a few minutes earlier. But then I remembered the bridge, the washed-out bridge, the police tape, the orange barrels blocking the road just a mile or so further down. There was no way through from that direction. Nothing but dead water and a broken road on the other side. And yet here were headlights, steady and unwavering, approaching from exactly that direction, moving at a normal speed like there was nothing at all stopping their path, like the road behind us was as smooth and unbroken as any other stretch of county highway. I watched in the mirror as the headlights reached the spot where the bridge should have been, where I had personally seen the gap in the road, the missing section, the barrels and tape strung up to keep anyone from driving straight into a washed-out ravine. The headlights didn't slow down. They didn't swerve or hesitate. They simply continued forward in a smooth, steady line, crossing over that exact spot as if the bridge were fully intact, as if there had never been any damage there at all, and kept coming toward us down the gravel road, the twin beams bouncing slightly with the small bumps in the road surface. Drive, my sister said, and her voice had gone completely flat, stripped of any of the playfulness from earlier in the night. Just drive. Right now. I didn't need to be told twice. I threw the car into gear and pulled back onto the road, gravel spraying out behind the tires as I pressed down on the gas harder than I probably should have on a road I didn't know well in the pitch dark. My hands were shaking slightly on the wheel, though I didn't fully register that until later, once we were safely back in town with the engine finally off. I kept my eyes moving between the road ahead and the mirror behind us, watching those headlights, waiting to see if they would speed up, if they would follow, if whatever was driving that car back there even had any interest in us at all, or if we were simply imagining a connection that wasn't really there. For a few agonizing seconds, the lights seemed to hold steady in the mirror, neither closing the distance nor falling back, just trailing along behind us at the same unhurried pace, as if whoever or whatever was driving that car had no particular urgency about where it was going. Then, as we rounded the bend that would take us back toward the grain silo and the paved road home, the headlights behind us simply weren't there anymore. No taillights disappearing into the distance. No sound of another engine on the gravel. Nothing. Just an empty road stretching out behind us in the dark, as quiet and undisturbed as if no car had ever been there in the first place. None of us spoke for the rest of that drive. Not one word, not even from Jenna, who up until that point had been the type of person who filled every silence with something. A joke, an observation, anything to keep the mood light and keep everyone laughing. She sat pressed against the car door the whole way back, staring out the window at the passing fields, her arms crossed tight over her chest like she was cold, though I know she wasn't. Not really, not with the heater running full blast the way I had it turned up. My sister sat rigid in the passenger seat beside me, her hands folded tightly in her lap, occasionally glancing at the side mirror, like she expected to see something there even after we'd left that gravel road far behind us and merged back onto the smooth paved highway that led into town. I drove faster than I normally would have on those back roads, faster than was probably safe, honestly. But I couldn't make myself slow down until we hit the edge of town again, until the streetlights started appearing overhead and the familiar shapes of houses and gas stations and the grocery store started sliding past the windows in their comfortable, ordinary glow. Only then did something in my chest finally start to loosen. That tight, coiled feeling I hadn't even realized I was carrying until it began to ease, replaced slowly by the more familiar sounds of town life. A dog barking somewhere, a porch light flickering on as we passed. Kids in costumes still wandering the sidewalks with their trick-or-treat bags. I dropped Jenna and Priya off first, both of them practically bolting from the car the second I pulled into Jenna's driveway, mumbling quick goodbyes without any of their usual Halloween excitement, without any talk of the candy they were supposed to be getting later that night, without any of the plans they'd made earlier about watching scary movies once we got back home. They just wanted to be inside, doors locked, lights on, and honestly, I understood the feeling completely, because some part of me wanted exactly the same thing. My sister and I drove the rest of the way home in that same heavy silence. It wasn't until we pulled into our own driveway, until I put the car in park and finally shut the engine off, the sudden quiet of the garage settling around us like a blanket, that either of us said anything at all. That wasn't the wrong house, she said quietly, staring straight ahead through the windshield at our own garage door. It was never gone. We just weren't supposed to see it yet. I didn't have an answer for that. I still don't. Honestly. Even now, years later. We've talked about that night plenty of times since then, usually around Halloween when the memory naturally resurfaces over dinner or during some late-night conversation when the topic of scary stories comes up. And mostly we laugh about it now, The way you laugh about things that scared you badly enough in the moment, but turned out fine in the end. We joke about how pale Jenna and Priya looked getting out of the car, how my sister didn't say a single word for the last 20 minutes of the drive, how I probably broke every speed limit on that gravel road trying to get us home as fast as the old car could manage. But there's always a moment in those conversations, a small pause, where one of us mentions the headlights crossing that broken bridge, and the laughter dies down just a little, replaced by something quieter, something neither of us has ever fully been able to shake off. Because out of everything that happened that night, the vanishing house, the reflections catching in the dark, the house appearing again exactly where it should have been all along, that's the part neither of us has ever been able to explain away. A bridge that wasn't there, and a car that crossed it anyway, coming toward us in the dark like it had somewhere to be, like it had been doing exactly that every single night for longer than either of us wanted to think about. That was, without question, the most silent car ride home I have ever been part of in my entire life. And to this day, none of us have ever gone looking for that road again, not even out of curiosity. Not even in broad daylight, when the whole idea of ghosts and haunted houses feels a little easier to laugh off. Every year when Halloween comes back around, my sister mentions it, usually with a joke, usually trying to make it sound lighter than it really felt that night. But I notice she never actually suggests we go back and check if the house is still standing there in that field, or if that bridge has ever been repaired, or if that road even leads anywhere at all anymore. And honestly, I've never brought it up either. Some questions, I think, are better left without an answer, especially the ones that come wrapped in headlights, crossing a bridge that was never really there. 2. When I was 17, my father moved into a new house. My parents had been divorced for a few years by then, each of them living apart, each slowly building their own separate version of life. The kind of quiet, careful rebuilding that happens after a marriage ends and two people have to figure out who they are on their own again. Somewhere in the middle of that rebuilding, my father had developed a habit that had slowly turned into something between a hobby and a small business. He would find rundown houses, places that had been neglected for years, sometimes decades, sitting empty or half forgotten on quiet streets. The kind of houses most people drove past without a second glance. He would buy them cheap, pour months of work into fixing them up with his own two hands and whatever extra money he could scrape together, and either sell them for a solid profit or rent them out to families who were looking for something affordable in a market that didn't offer much affordable anymore. He was good at it, genuinely good, in a way that always impressed me a little even as a teenager, who mostly took my father's talents for granted, the way kids do. He had an eye for houses other people overlooked, the kind with good bones hiding under peeling paint and water stains and decades of neglected maintenance. Houses that most buyers would take one look at and walk straight back out of. He seemed to see past all of that, past the sagging gutters and the cracked tile and the smell of dust that settles into a house nobody has properly lived in for years, straight through to what the place could become if somebody was willing to put in the work. And he genuinely seemed to enjoy the process, too, not just the profit at the end of it, but the actual work itself. The process of bringing something broken back to life one weekend at a time, one room at a time, until a house that had been sitting empty and forgotten slowly turned back into somewhere a family could live. This new house was, on paper at least, no different from any of the others he had worked on before. Just another project. Just another old place with a story nobody had bothered to ask about yet, sitting on its own quiet street waiting for someone to notice it again. The house had belonged to an elderly woman before my father bought it. She had lived there for a long time, decades from what I understood, long enough that the house had settled into the particular shape of her life, the way old houses sometimes do, carrying the faint impression of the people who spent years inside them, the way a favorite chair holds the shape of whoever sat in it the longest. She had passed away there, in her old age, in what I imagine must have been a quiet, ordinary sort of way, the way most long lives eventually end. After her death, her family had put the house on the market, likely eager to be rid of the upkeep and the memories both, the way families sometimes are when a house has outlived the person who made it feel like home. My father bought it not long after, sometime in late autumn, when the leaves were already thinning out on the trees and the evenings were starting to come earlier, and by winter he had moved in enough to make the place livable. Even if the renovations were still very much in progress, tools left leaning against unfinished walls, paint cans stacked in corners, the whole house existing in that strange in-between state of not quite being anyone's yet. I remember the first weekend we stayed over there clearly, partly because it was such an ordinary, unremarkable beginning to something that would end up sticking with all of us for years afterward. The kind of memory that only becomes significant in hindsight, once you understand what it was actually the start of. My two younger sisters and I packed overnight bags and drove over on a Friday evening, the way we did most weekends when it was our turn to stay with Dad, tossing clothes and toothbrushes and whatever books or games we wanted to bring into duffel bags without much thought, the whole routine so familiar by then that none of us paid it any special attention. The house was cold in the way new houses always are before they've been properly lived in, before the heating has settled into a rhythm and the walls have absorbed enough warmth to hold on to it through the night. There was a particular kind of chill to it, not unpleasant exactly, but noticeable. The kind of cold that reminds you a place hasn't yet become anyone's home, that it is still somewhere between its old life and whatever new life is about to be built inside it. My sisters shared one of the upstairs bedrooms, the two of them dragging their sleeping bags and pillows in together the way they always did, chattering about something or other as they settled in. My father took the room down the hall, the biggest of the upstairs bedrooms, though at that point it barely had more than a mattress and a lamp set up in it. And I had a smaller room to myself near the top of the stairs, the kind of room that still had the previous owner's curtains hanging in it, because nobody had gotten around to replacing them yet. Thin, floral, patterned things that let in more moonlight than they blocked out. That first night, I had a hard time falling asleep. Nothing unusual there. New places always did that to me as a teenager, the unfamiliar creaks and settling sounds a house makes when you're not used to it yet. Sounds that in your own bedroom you would recognize instantly and dismiss without a second thought, but in someone else's house, even your own father's house, somehow feel louder, more present, more worth listening to. The strange angle of moonlight coming through curtains that weren't the ones I was used to at my mom's place added to that feeling too. A small detail that shouldn't have mattered, but somehow did. The light falling across the floor in a shape I didn't recognize. I tossed and turned for a while, drifting in and out of sleep the way you do in an unfamiliar bed, waking up every so often, only to fall back asleep a few minutes later, without ever quite settling into anything deep or restful. But somewhere in the middle of that restless half-sleep, somewhere in one of those brief surfacing moments between one stretch of sleep and the next, I started to notice something. Every time I surfaced from sleep, even briefly, even for just a few groggy seconds before drifting back under, I could hear voices. Not loud, not distinct, but there, definitely there, drifting through the walls like the sound of a television playing at the lowest possible volume in another room. The kind of sound you have to actually pay attention to notice at all. A murmur, a back and forth quality to it, like a conversation, like two or three people talking quietly to each other somewhere close by, their words too soft and too muffled by the walls to actually make out, but the shape of a conversation unmistakably there underneath the muffling, the rise and fall of it, the pauses that felt like someone listening and then responding. I did not think much of it at the time, half asleep as I was, and not exactly in a state of mind built for careful reasoning. It made perfect sense to me, in that fuzzy, half-conscious logic that takes over in the middle of the night, that one of my sisters or my dad was also having trouble sleeping in this unfamiliar house, and had turned on a TV to keep themselves company, the way any of us might have done at home when sleep wouldn't come easily. I remember thinking, vaguely, that I should ask them to turn it down in the morning, a small, sleepy irritation forming somewhere in the back of my mind, and then falling back asleep, before the thought could fully form into anything more than that passing annoyance. It did not scare me. It did not even really register as strange, not that first night. It was simply background noise, the kind of thing you absorb and dismiss without giving it a second thought. Especially at that hour, especially that tired, especially in a house still unfamiliar enough that every sound felt slightly foreign anyway. Looking back now, years later, I try to remember the exact texture of that sound. The way you try to hold on to a dream after waking, grasping for details that seem to dissolve a little more each time you reach for them, and it is harder than I expect it to be. It was not sharp enough to be actual words, not structured enough to be a real conversation you could follow along with or make sense of. And yet, it had all the rhythm of one, all the natural back and forth cadence that real conversation has and background noise usually doesn't. Pauses that felt like someone listening carefully to what was being said. Little rises and falls that felt like someone responding, agreeing, maybe even laughing softly at something. If you have ever stood outside a room where a television is playing very quietly, low enough that you cannot make out any actual dialogue, but can still sense the back and forth pattern of two actors talking to each other on screen, that is the closest comparison I can offer. The closest I can come to describing what it actually sounded like lying there in that unfamiliar bed. Except there was no television playing anywhere in that house. Not that first night, and not on any of the nights that followed after it, a fact that none of us would fully appreciate the strangeness of until several mornings later. The same thing happened the second night. And the third. Each night unfolding in almost exactly the same pattern, waking in fragments throughout the darkest hours, hearing that same low murmur of conversation drifting through the walls from somewhere I couldn't quite pinpoint, assuming, without really thinking about it, that it was coming from whichever room, whichever family member, and each morning forgetting about it almost as soon as I was fully awake and distracted by breakfast, by whatever we had planned for the day, by the ordinary business of being a teenager on a weekend with her father and sisters, the small mystery of the nighttime murmuring, simply fading into the background of a normal weekend the way half-remembered dreams do. It was not until the third or fourth morning, I don't remember exactly which, that I actually brought it up out loud, mostly out of mild curiosity rather than any real concern. The kind of offhand question you ask at breakfast without expecting it to lead anywhere significant. We were all sitting around the kitchen table, eating breakfast, the smell of toast and coffee filling the room. Sunlight coming through windows that still needed new blinds, casting long, bright rectangles across the table, and the half-unpacked boxes still stacked against one wall. When I finally asked if anyone had been watching TV late at night, keeping it up past when the rest of us were trying to sleep, I explained, between bites of toast, that I kept hearing voices, quiet ones, like a television turned down low, coming from somewhere in the house each night before I finally managed to fall properly asleep. I wasn't trying to make anything of it. I just wanted to know whose television it was so I could maybe ask them to turn it down a little. The kind of small, practical household request that gets made in families all the time without anyone thinking twice about it. My father looked up first, his fork pausing halfway to his mouth, his expression shifting into something I could not quite place at the time, something that sat somewhere between confusion and a kind of careful stillness. My sisters exchanged a glance across the table, the kind of look siblings give each other when they've both been thinking the exact same thing, but neither one wanted to be the first to actually say it out loud. Worried maybe about sounding silly, or worried about something else entirely that neither of them could quite name yet. And then, one after another, slowly, almost reluctantly, they all confirmed the same thing. No, nobody had been watching TV. Not my father, not either of my sisters. But yes, every single one of them had heard the voices too, every single night since we'd moved in for the weekend. The quiet murmuring, the back and forth rhythm of conversation, the sense of 2 or 3 people talking softly somewhere close by. Every single one of us, independently, without discussing it with each other beforehand, without any of us thinking to mention it until that particular breakfast, had assumed the sound was coming from somebody else's room. We had all just been quietly attributing the noise to one another, night after night. Each of us lying awake in our own separate rooms, assuming a family member was the source, without ever once realizing, until that moment around the kitchen table, that none of us had actually been the source of it at all. For a moment, nobody said anything. The sunlight kept pouring in through the bare windows. The coffee kept steaming in its mugs. And the ordinary sounds of a Saturday morning kitchen kept going on around us. But there was a different quality to the silence at the table now. A kind of held breath quiet that hadn't been there a minute earlier. My youngest sister was the first to say something, her voice smaller than usual, asking if maybe it was coming from outside, from a neighbor's house, sound carrying strangely the way it sometimes does at night when everything else is quiet. My father offered a similar explanation, something about how old houses settle and creak, how pipes can sometimes make sounds that trick your ear into thinking you're hearing voices, how the mind fills in patterns where none really exist, especially in the depths of sleep when you're not fully processing what you're hearing anyway. It was a reasonable explanation. It is still, to this day, the explanation I lean on most of the time when I think back on that weekend, because it is far easier to accept than the alternative, and because none of us wanted to spend our first real weekend in the new house feeling unsettled about it. We finished breakfast. We spent the rest of the day the way we usually did on those weekends, helping my father with small parts of the renovation he trusted us to handle, running errands into town, watching movies together that evening with the volume turned up loud enough to fill the downstairs of the house with something familiar and comforting. But that night, lying in that same small bedroom with its floral curtains and its unfamiliar patch of moonlight on the floor, I found myself listening more carefully than I had the first 3 nights. Not out of fear, exactly, or not only out of fear, but out of a kind of curiosity that had been planted at that breakfast table and refused to be shaken loose. And sure enough, sometime in the deep hours of the night, in that same fragile space between sleep and waking, the murmuring came back. The same quiet rhythm, the same sense of 2 or 3 voices caught in an unhurried, ongoing conversation somewhere just beyond the reach of understanding. This time, knowing what I now knew, that nobody else in the house could be responsible for it, the sound felt different lying there in the dark. Not louder, not more distinct, but somehow more present, more clearly its own thing, rather than something I could simply attribute to a sibling's insomnia and dismiss. I remember lying very still, straining to catch even a single word, a single recognizable syllable, anything that might tell me what the voices were actually saying, anything that might turn the vague, unsettled feeling in my chest into something I could name and understand. But the words never resolved into anything clearer than that soft, steady murmur. The sound staying just on the edge of comprehension no matter how hard I listened, the way sounds sometimes do in dreams, always a little out of reach. I did not get up to investigate that night, and I don't think any of us did on any of the nights that followed. Not that first weekend, anyway. There is a particular kind of paralysis that comes with hearing something like that in the dark, a reluctance to actually get out of bed and go looking for its source. Because as long as you stay under the covers, as long as you don't actually confirm anything, there is still a small, comforting possibility that you imagined it, that it was nothing, that the explanation really was as simple as old pipes or a neighbor's television carrying farther than it should. Getting up and walking the hallway in the dark, checking each room, would have meant giving up that comfort. And none of us, not even my father, seemed willing to do that on those first few nights. Over the following weekends, as we continued staying at the house while the renovations slowly progressed, the voices kept appearing. Not every single night, but often enough that we all stopped being surprised by them, stopped mentioning them at breakfast the way we had that first time. It became, in a strange way, simply a feature of the house, something we all quietly acknowledged without ever fully discussing, the way families sometimes develop unspoken agreements about things nobody wants to examine too closely. My sisters would occasionally mention it to each other in whispered conversations I wasn't meant to overhear, comparing notes on which nights had been worse than others, but the topic rarely came up in front of my father anymore, as if we had all silently decided that talking about it openly gave it more power than simply living alongside it quietly. I sometimes wonder, now, so many years removed from that house and that particular stretch of my teenage years, what those voices actually were, if they were anything at all beyond some combination of old pipes and an unfamiliar house, and overactive teenage imaginations feeding off each other in the dark. I think about the elderly woman who lived there for decades before us, about the shape her life must have pressed into those walls over so many years, about whether some echo of her or of whoever she used to talk with in that house, late in the evenings the way people do, might have simply lingered there in a way that had nothing to do with anything supernatural at all. Just an old house, holding on to old sounds the way old houses sometimes seem to. I don't have an answer. Not really. And I've stopped expecting to find one. What I do know is that for as long as we stayed in that house, through that winter and into the following spring, while my father continued the slow work of turning it from someone else's old home into a livable place for new families to eventually move into, the voices never fully went away. And none of us ever mentioned them to anyone outside our own small circle, as if some unspoken instinct told us it was better kept between the four of us. My father eventually sold the house on to a young family looking for their first home together. The renovations finally finished, the floors refinished, and the walls freshly painted, and the old floral curtains long since replaced with something newer. I have often wondered, in idle moments over the years, whether that new family ever noticed anything themselves, whether they ever lay awake on their first nights in that house and heard, drifting faintly through the walls, the quiet, unhurried sound of a conversation that never quite resolved into words. I think about it more than I probably should, honestly, sometimes late at night, in my own apartment now, in a building that has nothing to do with that house or that neighborhood or that particular stretch of my life. I will catch myself lying still in the dark, listening for something, not quite sure what, before I realize what I'm doing and roll over and try to fall asleep like a normal person. who isn't waiting for murmuring voices to drift through a wall. Old habits, I suppose, or old memories that never fully let go of you, even when the house that created them is long since sold and repainted and lived in by strangers who probably have no idea any of this ever happened within those walls. My sisters and I still talk about that house sometimes, usually around a holiday dinner or during one of those late-night conversations that happen when everyone has had a little too much wine and starts pulling out memories nobody has mentioned in years. It always starts the same way. One of us bringing up some small, unrelated detail about our father's renovation projects, and then someone inevitably says the voices. And the whole table gets quiet for a second before everyone starts talking over each other, comparing memories, trying to remember details the others might have forgotten. My youngest sister swears she once heard her own name spoken clearly among the murmuring, though she admits now that she might have imagined it, half asleep and half convinced by her own fear that the voices were paying particular attention to her. My other sister claims the voices sounded happier on some nights than others, like whoever it was got along well together, like it wasn't anything sinister at all, just two old friends catching up the way people do late in the evening when the rest of the world has gone quiet. My father, for his part, has never fully admitted how much it bothered him, not directly anyway, though I noticed something in how he handled the house after that first weekend. He started leaving a small radio playing softly in the hallway some nights, something he never did in any of his other renovation projects before or since. Always some quiet talk station or an old jazz record turned down low, filling the empty hours with a sound that was at least explainable, at least something we could all agree on hearing and understanding. He never said why he started doing it. None of us ever asked him directly, and he never offered an explanation beyond a shrug and something about old houses needing a bit of noise to feel lived in. I think, looking back, it was less about the house needing noise and more about all of us needing something to drown out sounds that none of us wanted to keep hearing on our own. Whatever those voices actually were, whatever combination of old pipes and settling wood and imagination and coincidence might explain them away in the cold light of day, they have stayed with all four of us in a way that few other memories from that period of my life have. I can barely remember what I wore to school most days that year, or what shows we were watching, or half the small, ordinary details that used to make up an average weekend. But I remember, with startling clarity even now, the exact shape of that floral curtain pattern against the moonlight, the exact cold quality of the air in that unfinished bedroom, and the exact rhythm of that murmuring conversation drifting through the wall, rising and falling in a pattern, too natural, too alive, to have been nothing at all. Sometimes I think about reaching out to the family who bought the house from my father, just to ask, just to see if they ever noticed anything strange in those quiet hours between midnight and dawn. I never have, and I doubt I ever will. Some part of me is afraid of what the answer might be, and an even bigger part of me is afraid of what it might mean if the answer is simply no. If it turns out we were the only ones who ever heard it, if whatever it was somehow belonged specifically to us during that particular stretch of time we spent inside those walls. It is easier, in a lot of ways, to leave the question unanswered, to let that house keep its secret, the same way it apparently kept whatever conversation had been going on inside it long before any of us ever arrived to overhear it. When I was a kid, my parents had some work done on the house. It was a big project by our standards. Extensions built onto the back of the house, new rooms carved out of space that had never really been used properly before, and best of all, at least as far as I was concerned at the time, a converted attic that would become my bedroom. I remember how excited I was when they first told me about it. The idea of having my own space up at the very top of the house, away from my parents' room, away from the rest of the family. a little kingdom all my own, tucked up under the roof where nobody else really went. The attic conversion was fairly basic in a lot of ways, the kind of budget renovation a lot of families did back then. Practical rather than fancy, but to me it felt like the best room in the entire house. It was sort of open planned, which meant there was no proper door separating it from the rest of the house. No door at the top of the stairs the way you might expect in a normal bedroom. Instead, the narrow staircase just led straight up and opened directly into my room. No landing, no hallway, no barrier at all between where the stairs ended and where my bed began. At the time, I didn't think much of this arrangement. It was simply how my room was built, and as a kid, you tend to accept the shape of your own house without questioning it too much, the way you accept the shape of your own family or your own daily routine. Just another fact of life you were born into, rather than something you chose or even really noticed. I used to listen to the radio to fall asleep most nights, a habit I picked up early on and kept for years, long after most of my friends had moved on to other ways of winding down before bed. There was something comforting about it, the low murmur of voices or music filling the quiet of the house as I drifted off, a kind of company in the dark that made the unfamiliar creaks and settling sounds of an old house feel less unsettling. The radio itself was an old thing, nothing special, sitting on a little table at the foot of the stairs down on the landing below, positioned there mostly because that was where the nearest outlet happened to be, rather than for any particular reason related to me or my bedtime habits. Because of that open plan design, with no door to block the sound, the radio's noise would travel straight up the staircase and into my room, drifting up to me as I lay in bed, filling the space around me with whatever station I had chosen that particular night. I never had it too loud, though, always careful to keep the volume low enough that it wouldn't carry too far or bother anyone else in the house. My parents' bedroom was on the same level as the radio, just down the hall from where it sat on its little table, and the last thing I wanted was for them to come up and tell me to turn it off entirely, because it was keeping them awake. So I kept it low, just loud enough for me to make out the words or the music if I concentrated, just quiet enough to fade into the background as sleep started pulling me under. Every now and then I would change the channel depending on what I felt like listening to on any given night. Sometimes it was one of the pop stations, playing whatever was popular at the time, cheerful and upbeat even at low volume, filling my room with a kind of bright, familiar noise that felt comforting in its predictability. Other nights I preferred talk radio, the low, steady drone of adult voices discussing things I barely understood or cared about. Something about the rhythm of conversation that always made me sleepy faster than music did. The way a parent's voice reading a bedtime story used to work when I was even younger than I was by that point. And on this particular occasion, the night I'm telling you about, I had put the classical music station on, something I did fairly often actually, because there was a certain steadiness to it, an absence of lyrics or chatter that made it easy to drift off to without getting distracted by anything catching my attention. I want to be clear about something here, because it matters a lot to what happened later. I had listened to that particular classical station hundreds of times by that point in my life, probably closer to 1,000 if I really tried to count up all those nights over the years I'd had that radio in my room. And not once, not a single time in all those hundreds of nights, had I ever heard a song with actual lyrics being played on it. It simply wasn't that kind of station. It played orchestral music, instrumental pieces, symphonies and concertos, and the occasional piano solo. The kind of programming you'd expect from a classical station. The kind of music that by its very nature almost never involves any singing at all. The only actual human voices that ever came through that station were the hosts, occasionally breaking in between pieces to announce the name of the next composition Or give a bit of background on the composer. Always calm, always measured, always exactly what you'd expect from a late-night classical broadcast. That was the full extent of what that station ever offered in terms of voices, music, and the occasional host. Nothing else. Ever. That night, I fell asleep the way I usually did, the quiet strings and gentle piano notes drifting up the staircase into my room, filling the dark space around my bed with their familiar, soothing rhythm. I don't remember what specific piece was playing when I finally drifted off, though I've tried to remember many times since, wondering if there was some clue in it, some warning I missed in whatever the last thing I consciously heard was before sleep took over completely. I woke up to a really loud, strange sound. It took a few seconds for it to fully register. That particular fog of confusion that comes with being pulled abruptly out of a deep sleep. Your mind struggling to catch up with your senses, trying to make sense of what's happening before you're even fully conscious enough to process it properly. For those first few seconds, I just lay there in the dark, disoriented. My heart already starting to pound even before my brain had caught up enough to understand why. Slowly, as my mind cleared, I realized the sound was coming from downstairs, from the direction of the staircase, from exactly where I knew the radio sat on its little table. The sound itself was what I can only describe as being a very distorted voice, singing, not talking. Not the calm, measured tone of a radio host announcing the next piece. Singing a voice. Warped and strange in a way I struggle to fully put into words even now, years later. Stretched and twisted in a manner that didn't sound quite human, though it also wasn't quite anything else I could compare it to either. It wasn't like a recording playing too fast or too slow, and it wasn't like static interference garbling a normal broadcast. It was something else entirely. Something that had a rhythm to it, a melody even, but wrapped in a texture that made my skin crawl the moment I fully registered what I was hearing. And it was loud. Impossibly loud, especially compared to how quietly I always kept that radio set. It was blaring, filling the entire house from what I could tell, the sound reaching all the way up the staircase into my room with a force that felt completely disconnected from the low volume I knew I had set it to before falling asleep. I remember lying frozen in my bed for what felt like a very long time, but was probably only a few seconds, my whole body rigid with a fear I didn't fully understand yet. Listening to that distorted singing voice fill the darkness around me, unable to make out any actual words within it. Just that awful warped melody rising and falling in a pattern that felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. Eventually, some instinct pushed me out of bed, some combination of fear and the desperate need to make the sound stop that overrode the part of my brain telling me to stay frozen under the covers where it felt at least marginally safer. I ran downstairs, taking the steps two at a time in the dark. My bare feet hitting the cold wood of each stair as I hurried toward the source of that terrible sound, toward the little table at the foot of the stairs where the radio sat. I don't remember consciously deciding to do this. It felt more like my body moved before my mind had fully caught up, driven by some urgent need to shut off whatever was making that noise before it got any louder, before it woke the rest of the house, before whatever was happening got any worse. I turned off the radio as soon as I reached it, my hand finding the dial and twisting it hard, cutting the sound off abruptly, plunging the downstairs hallway back into a silence that felt almost as unsettling as the noise had been. My ears still ringing faintly with the memory of that distorted singing even after it had stopped completely. I stood there for a moment in the sudden quiet, my heart still pounding. my whole body trembling slightly in a way I couldn't fully control, waiting to see if anything else would happen, if the radio would somehow turn itself back on, if that voice would come back. Nothing did. The house stayed silent around me, the ordinary silence of a sleeping household. No other sounds beyond the usual creaks and settling noises any house makes in the middle of the night. I stood there a while longer anyway, unwilling to move, unwilling to trust that it was really over. What struck me almost as much as the sound itself, once I had time to think about it properly, was that neither of my parents heard what I heard, despite how loud it had been. Their bedroom was right there on the same level as the radio, close enough that they surely should have woken up, should have come out into the hallway to see what was happening, should have at the very least been disturbed enough by the noise to call out and ask if everything was okay. But nothing. No sound from their room at all. No footsteps, no concerned voices asking what was going on. The house stayed completely still around me except for my own frantic heartbeat and my own shaky breathing as I stood there in the dark hallway, utterly alone in whatever had just happened. I eventually made my way back to my room, though sleep did not come easily for the rest of that night, if it came at all. I lay in bed with the covers pulled up close, listening carefully to the silence below, half expecting that awful distorted singing to start up again at any moment, my whole body tense and alert in a way that made genuine rest impossible. I don't know exactly when I finally drifted off, but I remember the gray light of early morning starting to creep in around the edges of my curtains before my mind finally let go enough to sleep. The next morning, once the house was properly awake and the ordinary sounds of breakfast and getting ready for the day had replaced the memory of the night before with something more comfortably normal, I went downstairs and checked the radio, half expecting to find some explanation, some evidence of what had happened. A station accidentally switched. A volume dial somehow turned all the way up. Something, anything, that would let me make sense of what I'd experienced. But nothing had been changed. It was the same station, still set exactly to that same classical channel I had fallen asleep listening to, and the volume was still at that same low setting I always kept it at, exactly where I had left it before going to bed. Nothing about the radio itself gave any indication that anything unusual had happened at all. If I hadn't experienced it myself, if I hadn't run down those stairs in the middle of the night and turned that dial off with my own trembling hand, I might have started to wonder if I had simply dreamed the whole thing, if some particularly vivid nightmare had convinced me something had happened that never actually occurred outside my own sleeping mind. I mentioned it to my parents that morning, cautiously, still not entirely sure how to explain what I'd heard or whether they would even believe me. They looked at me with polite confusion, the kind of look parents give a child who has clearly had a bad dream, gently suggesting that maybe I had imagined it. Maybe some strange dream had bled into my waking perception in that confused half state right after waking up. A common enough thing for kids to experience, nothing to worry about. I didn't argue with them. Part of me wanted to believe that explanation too. Wanted badly for there to be some simple, ordinary reason for what had happened, rather than something I couldn't explain at all. But I knew what I had heard. I knew the difference between a half-remembered nightmare and the very real, very loud sound that had pulled me fully awake and sent me running down those stairs in a genuine panic. Needless to say, I stopped listening to the radio to fall asleep after that night. The habit that had comforted me for so many years, that had filled countless nights with familiar, soothing background noise, suddenly felt tainted, unsafe, in a way I couldn't fully rationalize away, no matter how many times my parents suggested it had simply been a dream. I switched to falling asleep in silence instead, or occasionally with a small nightlight on, Anything that didn't involve sound drifting up that open staircase into my room in the dark. Even now, years later, long after I moved out of that house and into places of my own, I still panic if I wake up to the sound of music being played, even under the most ordinary and explainable circumstances. If I fall asleep with the television on and wake up to some show's theme song playing, or if a phone alarm goes off with a melody instead of a simple beeping tone, there is still a split second of genuine, visceral fear that grips me before my rational mind catches up and reassures me that everything is fine, that this is simply an ordinary sound with an ordinary explanation. That fear has never fully gone away, not in all the years since. A small but persistent inheritance from that one strange night in my childhood bedroom. Whatever it was that was coming from the radio that night, whatever twisted and impossible version of a song filled our house while my parents slept undisturbed just down the hall, I don't ever want to know what it was trying to say. I have thought about that distorted singing more times than I can count over the years, lying awake sometimes trying to recall the exact texture of it, the exact warped melody, wondering if there had been actual words buried somewhere in that sound that I simply hadn't been able to make out in my panic. And every time that thought creeps in, I push it away just as quickly. Some sounds, I think, are better left unexplained. Better left as a strange, unsettling memory from childhood rather than something you go looking to fully understand. I never listened to that classical station again after that night. Not once. Not even years later, when I had my own place and my own radio and plenty of quiet nights that could have used some gentle background music to fall asleep to. Some habits, once broken by something you can't explain, simply never come back. Looking back on it now as an adult, I have tried, on and off, to come up with some kind of rational explanation for what happened, the way you do with most strange childhood memories once enough distance has passed that you can examine them with a calmer, more analytical mind. Maybe it was some kind of signal interference, I've told myself, some rogue broadcast bleeding into the frequency for just a few minutes in the middle of the night, distorted by weather or distance or some fault in the old radio's wiring. Maybe the station itself had some late-night programming block I never knew about. Something aired so rarely that in all those hundreds of nights I happened to simply miss it every other time. There are plenty of ordinary explanations I could reach for, and on calm afternoons, sitting somewhere well-lit and far from any staircase, those explanations sound almost convincing. But none of them ever quite settle the deeper unease that memory still carries, mostly because of that one detail that no rational explanation manages to smooth over: my parents, sleeping right there on the same floor as that blaring radio, close enough that any ordinary loud noise would have woken them instantly, never stirred at all. Any technical glitch loud enough to wake a 7-year-old 2 floors up through an open staircase should have been more than loud enough to wake 2 adults sleeping just down the hall. That single fact has always been the piece I can't quite explain away, no matter how many times I try to talk myself into believing it was simply some faulty wiring or a stray radio signal drifting in from somewhere it shouldn't have been. I brought the story up years later, as an adult, at a family dinner, half expecting my parents to have long since forgotten about it, or to laugh it off completely the way they had that first morning when I was still a frightened kid standing in the kitchen trying to explain what I'd heard. My mother, to my surprise, remembered it clearly, though her version of events had a small detail I hadn't remembered myself. She said that she actually had woken up briefly that night, not from any loud noise, but from a strange feeling that something in the house wasn't right, a vague, unsettled sense that pulled her out of a deep sleep for just a moment before she drifted right back under it, assuming it was nothing. She hadn't heard the singing at all, only that odd, instinctive tug of wrongness, gone again almost as quickly as it arrived. My father, for his part, still maintains he slept through the entire thing without so much as stirring, though he admitted, almost sheepishly, that he has never much liked classical music on the radio since, without ever being able to say exactly why. I don't know what to make of any of it, even now, with all these years of distance and all the calm, rational explanations I've tried on for size over time. What I do know is that the memory has never faded the way most childhood memories eventually do. Softened and blurred by time until you're not entirely sure anymore how much of what you remember actually happened, and how much your mind has quietly rewritten over the years. This one has stayed sharp, stayed vivid. Every detail of that dark staircase and that impossible distorted voice as clear to me now as it was the night it happened. And every so often, usually late at night when the house is quiet and I'm the only one still awake, I find myself glancing toward whatever radio or speaker happens to be nearby. Just checking, just making sure, before I finally let myself fall asleep. That old house eventually got sold, years after I'd already moved out and started my own life somewhere else entirely, my parents downsizing once they no longer needed all that extra space the extensions and the converted attic had once provided for a growing family. I don't know the people who live there now, have never met them, wouldn't even recognize them if I passed them on the street. But every so often I think about that staircase, about the open plan design with no door at the top, about how easily sound must still travel from that little landing all the way up into whatever bedroom occupies my old attic space now. I wonder if whoever sleeps up there has ever woken to something strange drifting up from below. I wonder if they've ever stood frozen in their bed in the middle of the night, trying to convince themselves that what they're hearing isn't real, the way I once did. I've told this story a handful of times over the years, usually late at night, usually to close friends gathered around in the kind of low, comfortable lighting that makes ghost stories feel appropriate rather than out of place. People react to it differently every time. Some laugh it off gently, offering their own version of the interference explanation, the faulty wiring theory, the stray broadcast signal theory, trying kindly to talk me back down into a version of the story that doesn't require anything unexplainable. Others go quiet instead, the way people sometimes do when a story touches some nerve they didn't expect it to touch, and ask me, almost hesitantly, whether I ever figured out what station it might have actually been broadcasting from, as if there might be some real answer out there waiting to be found if only someone looked hard enough. I never have an answer for them. I've never looked. Not really. Not with any real seriousness. Because some part of me has always suspected that looking too hard for an explanation is exactly the kind of thing that invites the answer to find you instead. It's easier, and honestly safer feeling, to leave the whole thing exactly where it happened, tucked away in that dark staircase in a house I no longer live in. A single strange night from a childhood, otherwise filled with entirely ordinary memories. Whatever that voice was trying to sing about, in whatever twisted and impossible way it was trying to sing it, I have made my peace with never knowing. Some doors, even the ones that were never actually there to begin with, are better left firmly closed. Sometimes, when I catch myself telling the story again, I notice how differently it lands depending on who's listening. Parents in the room tend to react the strongest, glancing instinctively toward whatever room their own kids are sleeping in, as if checking a distance, as if measuring how far sound would have to travel in their own house before it reached them. People who grew up in old houses with strange layouts, open staircases, thin walls, tend to nod along with a kind of quiet recognition, offering their own small, strange stories in return, the kind of memory everyone seems to carry from childhood if you sit with them long enough and ask the right questions. And every so often, someone will ask the one question I still can't fully answer myself if it happened again tonight. If I woke up right now to that same distorted singing drifting up through some open doorway, would I run toward it the way I did as a child? Or would I simply lie there in the dark, waiting for it to stop on its own? I still don't know. I hope I never have to find out. I grew up in a house that never let me forget it was not fully mine. Even as a small child, before I had the words to explain what I felt, I understood that something else moved through those rooms with us. You would hear the kitchen cabinets slam shut when nobody was near them, sharp and sudden, like someone angry had just finished searching for something and could not find it. You would feel a cold that had nothing to do with the weather outside, a chill that climbed slowly up your spine and settled at the back of your neck, making the small hairs there stand on end. For years, I told myself these were just the normal creaks and groans of an old building settling on its foundation, the kind of thing every house does when the temperature drops at night. I needed that explanation. I needed to believe it, because the alternative was too heavy for a child to carry alone. It was not until a conversation with my grandmother, decades later, sitting across from her kitchen table with 2 cups of tea going cold between us, that the last piece of my denial fell away. We had been talking about nothing important, the way you do with someone you love when you are simply enjoying being near them. I brought up the old house, half joking, the way you bring up something you have buried so deep you think it cannot hurt you anymore. I said something like, would it not be funny if we went and knocked on the door of the people living there now and asked them if they ever noticed anything strange? I expected her to laugh it off, to tell me I was being dramatic, to change the subject the way adults do when children ask questions they are not ready to answer. Instead, she went still. Her hands stopped moving around her cup. She looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before, something between sorrow and recognition, like she had been waiting a long time for someone to finally ask. She asked me if she had never told me that the family we bought the house from had done the exact same thing, that they had once sat where I was sitting now and asked her the same question, half laughing, half serious, wanting to know if the new owners of their old home had ever felt anything unusual within those walls. My grandmother said yes. She said yes without hesitation, because by then she had stopped pretending there was any other explanation. That single word, spoken so plainly, so calmly, after all these years of silence, hit me harder than any scream or shadow ever could. It meant that whatever lived in that house had been passed down like an inheritance nobody wanted, quietly, from family to family, each one too afraid or too embarrassed to speak the truth out loud until it was almost too late to matter. After that conversation, everything I had spent my whole life trying to convince myself was ordinary suddenly rearranged itself into something else entirely. And the memory that came rushing back to me first, the one that had haunted the edges of my mind for years without me ever giving it the weight it deserved, was the memory of a Christmas Eve when I was very young. I must have been 6 or 7 years old that year, small enough that the world still felt enormous and mostly kind. Small enough that I still believed with my whole chest in the magic of the holiday. We were staying at my grandmother's house that Christmas, the same house I am talking about now. The house with the cabinets that opened themselves and the cold spots that seemed to follow you from room to room like something invisible was walking beside you. My parents and I had gone to bed early that night, the way you do on Christmas Eve when you are a child desperate for morning to arrive faster than time will allow. I remember lying in the small guest bed in the room down the hall from my grandmother's, staring up at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around me, trying so hard to fall asleep because I had heard that Santa Claus would not come if the children in the house were still awake. I do not know exactly what hour it was when the footsteps woke me. I only know that I was pulled out of sleep by the unmistakable sound of someone walking across the living room floor, slow and deliberate, the old wooden boards creaking under each step in that particular way old houses have, a way that always sounds heavier than it should, as if whoever is walking is carrying something with them that you cannot see. My first thought, the thought that only a child half asleep on Christmas Eve could have, was that Santa Claus had arrived. There was no fear in me at all in that moment, only pure electric excitement. I threw off my blanket and slid out of bed, my bare feet touching the cold wooden floor, and I crept toward my bedroom door as quietly as I could, terrified not of what might be out there, but of getting caught and somehow ruining the magic before it could fully happen. I peeked first into my parents' room and then into my grandmother's, moving carefully down the hallway in the dark, my small hand trailing along the wall to guide me. Both doors were slightly open, the way they always were in that house, and in the dim light I could see my parents were still asleep in their bed, my father's breathing slow, and even my mother curled on her side, facing away from the door. I crept further to my grandmother's room and saw her too, asleep beneath a heavy quilt, unmoving, undisturbed. Everyone in the house was exactly where they should be. Nobody was awake. Nobody was walking around. And yet I had heard those footsteps so clearly, so unmistakably, that even now, all these years later, I can still hear the exact rhythm of them if I close my eyes and let myself remember. Satisfied that everyone was accounted for, and now more convinced than ever that what I had heard could only be one person, I hurried back toward the living room, my heart pounding with the kind of joyful terror only children feel on Christmas Eve. The fear of missing something wonderful, mixed with the thrill of almost catching it. I reached the living room and stopped in the doorway, breathless, expecting to see a figure in red kneeling by the tree, or at the very least some sign that someone had just been there. But the room was empty. The Christmas tree stood exactly as we had left it hours before, its lights blinking softly in the dark, the presents beneath it untouched, the ornaments hanging still and silent. Nothing had moved. Nothing had changed. There was no proof at all that anyone had been in that room, and yet I knew, with the absolute certainty children sometimes have about things they cannot explain, that I had not imagined those footsteps. I stood there for a moment in the dark, catching my breath, my eyes scanning every corner of the room, half expecting Santa to leap out from behind the couch or the tree, laughing at having fooled me. And that was when I heard it again. Footsteps, this time coming from the kitchen, moving quickly, almost as if whoever it was had heard me enter the living room and had darted away just in time to avoid being seen. Without a second thought, without even the faintest flicker of fear, I turned and ran toward the kitchen, my small feet slapping against the cold floor, my breath coming out in quick, excited bursts. I burst through the kitchen doorway, fully expecting to catch a glimpse of him this time, to finally see the man in the red coat with my own eyes, to have a story I could tell every other child at school for the rest of my life. But the kitchen, like the living room before it, was empty. The moonlight coming through the window above the sink cast long, pale shapes across the tile floor, and nothing moved within them. The cabinets were closed. The counters were bare except for the plate of cookies my grandmother had left out earlier that evening, still untouched, still arranged exactly as she had left them. I stood in the middle of that kitchen, spinning slowly in place, searching every shadow, every corner, waiting for movement, waiting for a sound, waiting for anything that would tell me where he had gone. And then, from somewhere behind me, back toward the hallway I had just come from, I heard it again. Footsteps, retreating, fading, drawing me forward the way a fisherman draws a hooked fish, letting it swim just far enough to believe it might escape before pulling the line taut again. I chased those footsteps for what felt, in my child's memory, like hours. I ran from the kitchen back into the living room, and from the living room down the hallway, and from the hallway into the small sitting room my grandmother kept near the front door, always one step behind whatever it was that walked ahead of me, always close enough to hear it, but never once close enough to see it. Every time I thought I had finally cornered it, every time I burst into a room certain I would find him standing there, ready with his sack of presents and his big warm laugh, the room would be empty and silent, and the footsteps would already be moving somewhere else, somewhere just out of reach, pulling me deeper into the chase. Looking back on it now, as an adult who has learned things about that house that no child should have to carry, I understand that whatever I was chasing that night was never trying to be caught. It was leading me, room to room, hallway to hallway, in a slow and patient circle through every corner of that house, the way something might lead a small animal deeper into the woods, away from safety, simply because it enjoyed the game of it. I do not know how long I ran through that house in the dark, my small lungs burning, my bare feet aching against the cold floors, my mind still somehow convinced, even as the excitement began to fade into something else, something heavier and more uncertain, that I was chasing something wonderful rather than something wrong. Eventually, exhaustion won out over wonder. I remember stopping in the hallway outside my bedroom, out of breath, my chest heaving, sweat cooling on my skin despite the winter chill in the house. I remember standing very still and listening, waiting for the footsteps to start again, and for the first time that night, hearing nothing at all. Not a creak, not a groan, not the sound of a single footstep anywhere in that house. Just silence, thick and complete, pressing in around me from every direction, as if the entire house was holding its breath along with me. It was in that silence, standing alone in the dark hallway, at whatever impossible hour of the night it must have been, that something in me finally shifted. The excitement I had carried since first waking up drained out of me all at once, replaced by something colder and far less familiar. I did not have the words for it then. I would not have those words for years. But looking back, I know now that what I felt standing in that hallway was the first real fear of my life. The kind that settles into your bones rather than your thoughts. The kind you feel before your mind has even finished understanding what there is to be afraid of. I did not wait around to figure out what it meant. I turned and walked quickly back to my room, climbed into bed, and pulled the blankets up over my head the way children do when they believe fabric can stop what is real from reaching them. I fell asleep eventually, more from exhaustion than comfort, and when I woke the next morning to the sound of my parents calling me to come open presents, the entire night already felt distant and unreal, the way dreams do once daylight arrives to erase them. For years afterward, I told the story of that Christmas Eve the way you tell a funny childhood memory, laughing about how badly I wanted to catch Santa Claus, how I ran myself ragged through my grandmother's house chasing a sound that was never really there. My parents laughed along with me every time, and my grandmother, I now realize, never laughed at all. She would smile, politely, the way you smile, when you are trying not to let your face show what you are actually feeling. And she would quickly change the subject, asking if anyone wanted more coffee, or mentioning something that needed doing in the kitchen. At the time, I never noticed the pattern. I was a child wrapped up in my own nostalgia. too young to read the discomfort behind an adult's carefully arranged smile. It was only after our conversation at our kitchen table, all these years later, that I finally understood why she never wanted to talk about that night, and why the story I told so lightly for so long was, for her, something far more serious. Because once she confirmed what the previous owners had told her, once she admitted, plainly and without any hesitation, that they too had experienced things in that house that they could never explain, I began to see my Christmas memory in an entirely different light. I was no longer a child chasing an imaginary Santa Claus through a house full of harmless holiday magic. I was a child being led, deliberately and patiently, through every room of a house that something else considered its own. Something that knew exactly how to draw a small, excited child forward without ever letting itself be seen. Something that understood the particular hunger children feel on Christmas Eve and used it, turned that innocent excitement into a leash it could pull me along by. Room after room, hallway after hallway, for as long as it wanted to keep the game going. What frightens me most now, thinking back on it as an adult, is not the footsteps themselves, though even now the memory of that sound is enough to raise the hair on my arms. What frightens me most is how easily I followed, how willingly a small child ran through a dark house alone in the middle of the night, chasing something he could hear but never see, simply because his heart was full of belief and his mind had not yet learned to be afraid of the dark in the way it should have been. Children trust so completely. They trust the world to be kind to them. They trust that the sounds they hear in the night have gentle explanations. They trust that whatever is calling them forward must be calling them toward something good. Whatever lived in that house understood that trust better than I did, and used it against me without me ever realizing. Until decades later, sitting across a kitchen table from my grandmother, the truth finally caught up to the memory and gave it the shape it had always deserved. My grandmother eventually told me more that afternoon, once the first confession had broken something open between us that neither of us seemed able to close again. She told me that the previous owners had described their own children hearing footsteps at night. Footsteps that led them from room to room the same way mine had led me. Always retreating, always staying just out of sight. She told me that one of their children had once gone missing for nearly 20 minutes in the middle of the night, only to be found asleep on the floor of a closet that had been locked from the outside, a closet none of them could ever explain how she had gotten into. She told me that the previous owners had eventually stopped asking questions altogether, had stopped trying to understand what walked through their home at night, because every answer they found only led to more unsettling questions, and at some point they simply decided it was easier and safer to let the house keep its secrets. I asked her, my voice quieter than I meant it to be, if she had ever heard the footsteps herself in all the years she lived there before I was born, in all the years after. She was quiet for a long moment before she answered. She told me that she had, more than once, and that she had made peace with it the same way the family before her had, by choosing not to look too closely at what she could not change. She told me that some houses simply carry something with them, something that outlasts every family that passes through, something that watches and waits, and occasionally, on nights when the walls between worlds feel thinner than usual, decides to remind you that you are not as alone in your own home as you believe yourself to be. I have not been back to that house since we sold it, many years ago now. I do not know the family who lives there today, though sometimes, late at night, I find myself wondering if they have ever heard footsteps in their living room, if their cabinets ever slam shut without a hand to close them, if their children have ever woken on some quiet night and followed a sound through the dark, believing with their whole innocent hearts that they were chasing something wonderful, I think about knocking on their door one day, the way I joked about with my grandmother, and asking them plainly if they have ever felt something walk beside them in that house. But some part of me is afraid of what they might say. Some part of me already knows the answer, has known it since I was a child, running barefoot through the dark on Christmas Eve, chasing footsteps that were never going to let themselves be caught. Footsteps that were only ever leading me deeper into a game I never understood I was playing, in a house that has never truly belonged to any of the families who called it home. About 10 years ago, I used to run at a walking path that followed alongside a river, close to a park not far from where I lived at the time. It was one of those quiet little green spaces that most towns have, not particularly famous or well used, just a stretch of grass and trees with a paved path winding along the water. The kind of place locals knew about, but tourists never bothered visiting. I liked running there specifically because it wasn't crowded. After a long day at work, the last thing I wanted was to dodge other joggers or families out for a stroll. I wanted quiet. I wanted the sound of the river and my own footsteps and nothing else. And that particular trail gave me exactly that almost every single time I went. I would park my car at the soccer fields near the entrance to the park, a gravel and asphalt lot that served both the fields and the trailhead, and make my way on foot from there to the actual walking path itself. A short walk of maybe 5 minutes before I reached the part where the trail properly began following the river. The lot itself was nearly always empty when I arrived, especially in the early evening, which was the time of day I usually preferred to run once the worst of the daytime heat had passed, but before it got dark enough to make the trail feel unsafe. Sometimes there would be one or two other cars scattered across the lot, belonging to other runners or dog walkers or the occasional fisherman trying his luck along the riverbank, but for the most part it was just me and my own car sitting alone out there, engine ticking as it cooled in the quiet. That evening, the evening this whole thing happened, started out exactly like any other run I had done dozens of times before at that same trail. I remember it being a pleasant temperature, not too hot, not too cold, the kind of evening that made running feel easy rather than like a chore. I parked in my usual spot, laced up my shoes, stretched for a minute or two against the hood of my car, and then headed off toward the trailhead the way I always did, my mind already settling into that pleasant, half-empty state that running always puts me in, thoughts drifting loosely from one thing to another without any real urgency behind them. The run itself was uneventful, exactly the kind of peaceful, meditative experience I always went to that trail, hoping to have. I passed the usual landmarks along the way, the old wooden footbridge about a mile in, the bend in the river where the water ran a little faster over some rocks, the small clearing near the halfway point where I always paused for a few seconds to catch my breath before turning back toward my car. I didn't pass many other people that evening, maybe one or two joggers coming the opposite direction, a woman walking her dog near the start of the trail. Nothing unusual, nothing that stood out at all in my memory until I actually made my way back to the parking lot at the end of my run. Walking back toward my car, slightly out of breath, my shirt damp with sweat the way it always was after a good run, I noticed a van parked next to mine. It hadn't been there when I arrived, I was fairly certain of that, since I distinctly remembered my car sitting completely alone in that section of the lot when I first parked. The van was one of those larger, windowless, cargo-style vans, plain and nondescript, the kind of vehicle you see all the time on the road without ever really registering it, used by contractors or delivery services or any number of completely ordinary businesses. Under normal circumstances, I probably wouldn't have thought twice about it at all. There was a man sitting in the driver's seat of the van as I approached my own car, just sitting there, not doing anything in particular that I could see. Not on his phone, not eating anything. not obviously waiting for someone in the way you might expect if you were picking up a family member from the trail or the soccer fields nearby. He was just sitting there, and as I got closer to my own car, close enough that our vehicles were essentially parked door to door, I glanced over toward him, the way you do instinctively when there's another person nearby. A small, polite acknowledgement of another human being sharing the same space as you. I gave him a small smile, nothing more than the kind of automatic, meaningless smile you give a stranger in passing, the social reflex most of us have been trained into since childhood, a way of saying, I see you, I mean you no harm, without actually engaging in any real interaction. He didn't smile back, not that I specifically remember, though at the time I didn't think much of that either. Not everyone smiles back. Not everyone is in a smiling kind of mood, and I didn't want to make more of it than a simple, forgettable moment of two strangers happening to park next to each other in an empty lot. I got into my car, started the engine, and began my way home, following the same route I always took after running at that particular trail. A route I had driven probably 100 times before without ever once thinking about it consciously. My hands and feet knowing the turns almost automatically, while my mind stayed occupied with whatever thoughts happened to be drifting through it after a good run. For the first minute or two of the drive, I didn't think about the van or the man in it at all. It had already slipped from my mind entirely, filed away as nothing more than a forgettable detail from an otherwise ordinary evening. Well, this dude follows me. I didn't notice it right away, not in those first couple of minutes, but as I glanced in my rearview mirror at some point, out of nothing more than habit, I saw the van pulling out of the lot behind me, following the same road I had just turned onto. I still wasn't particularly worried at first. It made a certain amount of sense, honestly, since the road leading away from the park only really went in one direction for the first stretch, before splitting off toward the different neighborhoods surrounding the area. Plenty of people leaving that park would naturally end up on the same road for at least the first mile or so before going their separate ways, and I told myself that was probably exactly what was happening here. I kept driving, and the van kept following, staying a reasonable distance back, not doing anything overtly aggressive or threatening. And for a little while longer, I genuinely didn't think much of it. It wasn't until I took a few of the unorthodox turns that I typically use to get back to my house, the kind of shortcut route that locals develop over time, cutting through smaller residential streets rather than sticking to the main roads, turns that had no logical reason to be part of any normal route toward the more commonly traveled parts of town, that I started to feel the first real prickle of unease. He's still behind me. That realization landed heavier than I expected it to, a sudden shift in my stomach as I watched those headlights in my rearview mirror make the exact same unusual turn I had just made, a turn that really didn't lead anywhere except deeper into a fairly quiet residential neighborhood. Nowhere a stranger unfamiliar with the area would have any obvious reason to be heading unless they were specifically following someone who lived there. My hands tightened on the steering wheel almost without my conscious permission, my whole body suddenly alert in a way it hadn't been just moments earlier. Adrenaline starting to creep into my bloodstream as my mind scrambled to make sense of what was happening. So I began weaving my way through the neighborhoods, trying to lose some creepy guy in a van who had no business following me down streets that led nowhere in particular except toward more houses, more quiet residential blocks. Definitely not toward any main road or shopping area that a stranger might have a legitimate reason to be navigating toward. I took turn after turn, sometimes doubling back the way I had come, sometimes cutting through streets I hadn't used in months, trying to build a route so unpredictable and confusing that there was no way an unfamiliar driver could keep pace with it, without very obviously revealing their intentions. My heart was pounding by this point. adrenaline fully flooding my system now, my eyes darting constantly between the road ahead of me and my rear view and side mirrors, trying to track exactly where that van was relative to my own position, trying to calculate whether I was actually gaining any distance or whether he was still managing to keep pace despite my increasingly erratic route. I remember gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached, my breathing coming faster and shallower than it had even during the run itself, my whole body locked into a state of pure fight or flight that I hadn't experienced in years, maybe ever. Not like this. I thought seriously, in those frantic minutes, about driving straight to the nearest police station, or pulling into a well-lit gas station where there would be other people around, cameras, some measure of visible safety that an empty residential street simply couldn't offer. Part of me hesitated on that plan, though, worried about actually leading him directly to a fixed location where I would then have to get out of my car. Worried that stopping anywhere at all might give him the exact opportunity he seemed to be waiting for, whatever that opportunity actually was. So instead, I kept moving, kept turning, kept trying to put distance and confusion between us rather than risk stopping anywhere at all, until I felt reasonably certain he was no longer behind me. I finally managed to lose him somewhere in the middle of that maze of turns, glancing in my mirror at one particular moment and realizing, with a wave of relief so intense, it almost made me feel sick, that the van's headlights were no longer visible behind me anywhere. I kept driving for several more minutes after that, though, taking an even longer, more roundabout route back toward my actual house than I normally would have, just to be absolutely certain he hadn't simply fallen back out of sight, rather than genuinely losing me altogether. I circled through a couple more unfamiliar streets, checked my mirrors obsessively the entire time, and only finally allowed myself to head directly home once I felt reasonably confident that no headlights were tracking my movements anymore. When I finally pulled into my own driveway, I sat there in my car for a long moment before actually getting out, my hands still trembling slightly against the steering wheel, my heart still beating far faster than it should have been given that I was no longer actually running or driving evasively through side streets. I remember looking around the quiet street outside my house, checking every direction carefully before finally opening my car door, half convinced that Van might somehow reappear even now. Parked somewhere nearby, waiting, I made it inside safely that night, locked every door behind me more carefully than I normally bothered to, and spent a good portion of the rest of that evening still shaking slightly from the adrenaline that hadn't fully worked its way out of my system yet. I didn't call the police that night, which in hindsight I sometimes wish I had done, if only to have some kind of official record of the incident. But at the time, I told myself nothing had technically happened, no actual contact, no explicit threat, beyond a van simply following the same series of turns I happened to take. Something that would have been difficult to explain convincingly to a dispatcher without it sounding, at least on the surface, somewhat exaggerated or paranoid. I have thought about that evening many times since then, replaying it over and over, trying to figure out what exactly that man's intentions actually were, whether he had specifically targeted me for some reason at the trailhead, whether it was some kind of opportunistic thing where he simply followed whichever lone woman happened to be walking back to her car in that empty lot that evening, or whether there was some other explanation entirely that I've simply never been able to figure out. I will never actually know the answer, and honestly, I've made a kind of uneasy peace with that uncertainty over the years, choosing not to dwell on it too heavily, even as the memory itself has never fully faded. What I do know, with complete certainty, is that I haven't been back to run at that trail since. Not once in all the years since that evening happened. It's strange, in a way, how a single incident, one that technically ended without any physical harm coming to me at all, could permanently close off a place I used to genuinely love, a trail I had run probably hundreds of times before that evening without a single problem. But that's exactly what happened. Every time I've considered going back over the years, some part of my mind immediately returns to that image of the van sitting next to my car, that man's blank expression as I smiled at him out of pure social habit. The sight of his headlights following turn after unlikely turn through my own neighborhood. And I simply can't bring myself to risk it again, no matter how much I genuinely miss running along that particular stretch of river. I've told this story to a handful of people over the years, mostly other women, and almost every single one of them has had some version of their own similar experience to share in return. A stranger who followed them a little too closely. A car that seemed to trail them home from somewhere they thought was safe. A moment of instinct kicking in that told them something was wrong long before they had any concrete evidence to point to. It's a strange, uncomfortable kind of solidarity, hearing how common these experiences actually are once you start actually talking about them openly. And it has made me trust my own instincts a lot more since then, rather than second-guessing that gut feeling of unease the way I probably would have before that evening happened to me. I still run, just not at that particular trail anymore. I've found other places closer to home, busier paths with more consistent foot traffic, parking lots that never sit quite so empty, spaces where I feel like there would always be other people around if something ever went wrong again. It's not quite the same peaceful, solitary experience that old Riverside Trail used to offer me. And some part of me still misses that quiet stretch of water and trees more than I probably should for a place I've deliberately avoided for 10 years now. But I would rather have that small, lingering sense of loss than ever find myself back in that position again, driving frantically through unfamiliar turns in my own neighborhood, watching a stranger's headlights refuse to fall away from my rearview mirror. Looking back on it now, a decade later, I've had a lot of time to think about the small details of that evening that I might not have paid much attention to at the time. Details that seem more significant now with the benefit of hindsight than they did in the moment itself. I remember, for instance, that the van didn't have any visible company markings on it. No logo, no phone number, nothing that would suggest it belonged to any kind of legitimate business, which at the time didn't strike me as particularly unusual since plenty of ordinary people drive plain cargo vans for entirely mundane personal reasons. But looking back, I find myself wondering whether that plainness was intentional, a vehicle chosen specifically because it wouldn't draw attention or stick in anyone's memory the way a marked company van might have. I also remember, now that I think about it carefully, that he didn't appear to be doing anything at all before I walked up. No phone in his hand, no map spread out on the dashboard. No obvious reason to simply be sitting there in an empty lot beside the trailhead. At the time, I didn't think anything of it, since people sit in parked cars for all kinds of ordinary reasons, waiting for someone, taking a phone call, simply resting for a few minutes before continuing on with their day. But the complete stillness of it, the sense that he was just there, waiting, has taken on a different weight in my memory over the years, especially once he started following me. I've also thought a lot about the timing of it all, how he must have started his engine and pulled out of that lot almost immediately after I did, closely enough behind me that he was already visible in my mirror within the first couple of minutes of my drive. That kind of immediate response has always struck me as more deliberate than coincidental. The kind of readiness that suggests someone who was actively waiting for the right moment, rather than someone who simply happened to be leaving the park at the same time I was, for entirely unrelated reasons of their own. For a long time after that night, I found myself being far more cautious in general, not just about that particular trail, but about small, everyday situations I never used to think twice about. I started parking closer to entrances at grocery stores, even if it meant circling the lot a few extra times looking for a spot. I started keeping my phone in my hand rather than in my bag when walking to my car alone in the evenings, ready to call someone or dial for help at a moment's notice if I ever needed to. I became the kind of person who glances in her rearview mirror a little more often than strictly necessary, who notices unfamiliar cars parked on her own street a little more attentively than she used to, who trusts that prickling sense of unease immediately rather than talking herself out of it the way I probably would have before all of this happened. I mentioned earlier that I never called the police that night, and while I still understand exactly why I made that choice in the moment, exhausted, shaken, desperate, mostly just to get inside and lock the door behind me. It's a decision I've revisited many times since with a certain amount of regret. If nothing else, filing some kind of report might have created a record, something that could potentially have been useful if anyone else in the area ever experienced something similar with the same van or the same man. A pattern that authorities might have eventually been able to notice and act on if enough separate incidents were ever reported. I sometimes wonder, uncomfortably, whether other women who ran or walked at that same trail after me ever had a similar encounter. Whether that van or a similar one was still sitting in that same quiet lot on other evenings, waiting for someone else to walk back to their car and offer that same small, meaningless smile I gave him. A friend of mine, years later, after I finally told her the full story one night over dinner, gently suggested that I should have gone straight to a police station that evening instead of driving home, and she's probably right, looking back on it with a clearer head than I had in the moment. But there's a particular kind of tunnel vision that takes over during genuine fear, a narrowing of thought down to the single most immediate goal, which in my case was simply getting somewhere I felt safe as quickly as possible, without much room left over for more strategic thinking about reports or evidence or anything beyond that basic, urgent need to put distance between myself and whatever threat I believed I was facing. I don't know what would have happened if he had actually caught up to me that evening, if I hadn't managed to lose him in that maze of residential streets, and I try not to spend too much time imagining it, though the thought does creep in occasionally. Usually late at night, when I'm lying awake for some unrelated reason, and my mind starts wandering toward old fears instead of settling into sleep. I like to think I would have found some way to keep myself safe regardless, that I would have driven straight to somewhere public and well-lit the moment I realized losing him wasn't going to work, but I genuinely don't know for certain. And that uncertainty itself is part of what has stayed with me so persistently over the years since. What I try to focus on instead, when that memory does resurface, is the fact that I did get away, that whatever his intentions actually were, I managed to keep myself safe that night, through nothing more than a stubborn refusal to let him catch up, and a fairly good memory for the confusing back streets of my own neighborhood. It isn't much of a victory in the grand scheme of things, I suppose, since nothing was ever actually resolved, no explanation was ever found, no consequence was ever handed down to whoever that man was or whatever he had planned. But it's the victory I have, and most days I try to let that be enough, even as I continue avoiding that particular stretch of river, 10 years on, still unwilling to risk finding out whether he or someone like him might still occasionally be waiting in that same quiet, empty lot beside the trail. Every once in a while, I'll drive past the entrance to that park, on my way to somewhere else entirely, catching a brief glimpse of the soccer fields and the gravel lot beyond them through my car window, and I feel a small, familiar tightening in my chest each time, an old instinct that has never quite faded no matter how many years have passed since that evening. I never slow down when I pass it. I never turn in, even out of simple curiosity, Even on bright, sunny afternoons when the lot is clearly full of ordinary families and their ordinary cars, nothing at all like that quiet, empty evening 10 years ago. Some places, once they've been marked by fear like that, simply stay marked, no matter how much time or distance you put between yourself and them. I sometimes think about the version of me who used to run there so happily, headphones in, mind wandering, never once worried about who might be sitting in the parking lot waiting for her to finish. I miss that version of myself a little. The one who trusted quiet, empty places without a second thought. She's still in there somewhere, I think, just a bit more careful now, a bit more watchful, carrying a small, permanent reminder that not every smile gets returned the way you expect it to, and that sometimes the safest thing you can do is simply trust the feeling in your gut and keep on driving. I live in a pretty small town in Ohio, right in the middle of Amish country. The kind of place where farmland stretches out for miles and horse-drawn buggies are just as common a sight on the back roads as regular cars. Growing up there, especially during high school, boredom was a constant problem for me and my friends, since there wasn't a whole lot to actually do most nights beyond the usual small-town stuff, hanging out at someone's house, driving around aimlessly, maybe grabbing food at the one late-night place still open past 10. So we always tried to cure that boredom by finding off-the-path places to go. The kind of spots most people in town either forgot about or deliberately avoided, abandoned buildings and back roads and old properties that had a story attached to them, even if nobody could quite agree on what that story actually was. One night, a group of us had gotten together to watch the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the classic one from the 70s, passing around snacks in someone's basement, and getting ourselves properly worked up by the whole atmosphere of the film. That gritty, grainy, unsettling feeling it has that still holds up even decades later. By the time the movie ended, we were all sitting there in that particular charged silence that comes after watching something genuinely unsettling together. Everyone a little too aware of the dark corners of the room, everyone half joking and half serious about how creeped out they felt. And in that specific mood, somebody, I don't even remember who exactly, brought up an abandoned house that my buddy knew about, out in the woods a ways from town, and we figured it would be a great idea to go check it out that same night, immediately, while the movie's atmosphere was still fresh in all our minds. Looking back now, it's almost funny how obviously bad an idea that was. Going to explore some abandoned building in the woods at night immediately after psyching ourselves out with a horror movie about exactly that kind of scenario. But we were teenagers in a small town with nothing else going on, and the idea had already taken hold of the group in that particular way ideas do sometimes, gaining momentum with each person who agreed to it until turning back would have felt more awkward than actually following through with the plan. To get to this house, we had to park on a gravel road that ran along the edge of some farmland, cross a shallow river that cut through the woods out there, and then walk about a mile further into the trees before reaching the property itself. It wasn't an easy trip by any means, especially at night, picking our way carefully across slick rocks in the river and then navigating through dense underbrush and low-hanging branches for that long stretch through the woods afterward. There were about 10 of us on the trip in total, a pretty big group by our usual standards, everyone carrying flashlights to help light the way through the darkness of the trees, beams bouncing off trunks and swinging wildly whenever someone stumbled over a root or a rock along the uneven path. I brought my shotgun with me too, honestly just for shits and giggles more than anything. The kind of thing you bring along on a dumb teenage adventure into the woods, mostly because it makes you feel a little safer and a little cooler at the same time, not because you seriously expect to need it for anything. I remember the weight of it slung over my shoulder as we crossed the river my sneakers already soaked through from slipping on one of the wetter rocks. Everyone laughing and joking nervously the whole way. That particular blend of excitement and unease that comes from doing something you know is probably a little reckless. We eventually made it through the woods and walked up to the house itself, and I remember the way it looked emerging out of the darkness ahead of us, illuminated in bits and pieces by our overlapping flashlight beams. It was a turn-of-the-century mansion, genuinely old, the kind of grand architecture you don't really see built anymore. Tall and imposing even in its ruined state, with no driveway leading up to it at all, just open overgrown ground stretching from the tree line right up to what would have once been the front steps. It had clearly been abandoned for a very long time, decades probably, judging by how thoroughly nature had already started reclaiming it. Vines crawling up the sides of the walls, windows either broken out entirely or clouded over with grime and age. The whole structure carrying that particular heaviness that truly old, truly abandoned buildings seem to have. A silence that feels deeper and more deliberate than ordinary quiet. We couldn't actually walk inside the house itself, because the second floor had collapsed entirely onto the first at some point over the years, leaving the interior nothing but a jumbled, dangerous mess of broken beams and fallen debris that nobody in their right mind would try to climb through, especially not at night with only flashlights to see by. So instead, we started walking around the outside of the house, flashlight beams sweeping across the crumbling exterior walls, everyone talking in that hushed, half-joking tone people use when they're trying to sound braver than they actually feel in a genuinely unsettling place. As we were walking around the outside, one of my buddies noticed a bunch of writing scrawled across one of the exterior walls, faded but still legible in places. The kind of graffiti and markings that accumulate on abandoned buildings over the years from whoever else has wandered out there before you. We all gathered around with our flashlights to take a closer look, curious more than anything at first, trying to make out what exactly had been written there. And as we took a closer look, we noticed that at the end of all that writing, whatever words and symbols had been scrawled across the crumbling plaster, there were 10 different sets of initials. 10, the exact number of people standing there with me in that group that night. And as we compared them, one by one, calling out initials and matching them against names, every single set matched a different person actually present in our group at that exact moment. My initials were there. My buddy's initials were there. Every single person's initials, matched precisely, scrawled onto that wall in a house none of us had ever visited before, in writing that looked like it had been there for a while. Not fresh, not recently added, just sitting there, waiting, apparently, for us to eventually show up and find it. That really creeped out a bunch of the girls in our group especially, on top of everyone already being pretty on edge after watching the movie earlier that night. A couple of them immediately wanted to leave, insisting there was no way that was a coincidence, no reasonable explanation for how our exact initials, all 10 of us, could possibly already be written on the wall of an abandoned house none of us had ever set foot near before that night. The guys tried to play it cool, throwing out theories about common initials, coincidence, maybe somebody had been out there before and heard rumors about our group somehow, though honestly, none of those explanations held up particularly well under any real scrutiny, and I don't think any of us actually believed them even as we said them out loud. As we turned to walk away from that wall, still shaken and arguing quietly among ourselves about what it could possibly mean, I heard my buddy yell from the other side of the house, "Hey, I found something." His voice carried this excited, almost frantic energy to it that immediately pulled the whole group's attention, and we all ran over toward the sound of his voice without much hesitation. Flashlight beams bouncing wildly as we hurried around the side of the crumbling structure. We found him standing there, staring intently into a first-floor window, one of the few that still had enough intact glass and frame to actually look through rather than being completely broken out. He pointed his flashlight through the window, and the rest of us crowded around, craning to see whatever had caught his attention. There, hanging from the ceiling inside that ruined first-floor room, tied to a length of rope, was a white wedding dress. It hung there completely still in the stale, undisturbed air of that collapsed interior, and across the front of it, spreading out from somewhere around the chest, was what looked like a huge, dark bloodstain. Discolored with age, but still unmistakably the shape, and pattern a large amount of blood would leave behind soaking into fabric. Nobody said anything for a moment. We just stood there, all of us crowded around that single window, staring in at that dress hanging silently in the dark. The beam of my buddy's flashlight, the only thing illuminating it at all, casting long, strange shadows across the debris scattered around it on the floor below. We immediately backed away from the window after that. An instinctive, unanimous decision that didn't require any discussion. Everyone's nerves already stretched thin enough from the initials on the wall without adding this new discovery on top of it. But after 2 steps back, I felt a shift underneath my feet. A sudden give in the ground that hadn't been there a moment before. The kind of sensation that registers as wrong before your brain fully catches up to explain why. Next thing I know, there was a loud crash, and 6 of us were falling straight through the ground. The earth simply giving way beneath our combined weight without any warning at all, plunging us downward into darkness before any of us had a chance to react or brace ourselves properly. We fell about 10 feet down, landing hard under the house in a large room that none of us had known existed until that exact moment. It wasn't a basement, not in any conventional sense. Since it had no finished walls, no concrete flooring, nothing that would suggest it was ever part of the original architectural plan for that mansion. It was just dirt walls and a dirt floor, a rough, hollowed-out space beneath the collapsed structure above, the kind of hidden room that somebody had to have deliberately dug out and maintained at some point, not something that occurred naturally through decades of decay and collapse. I shined my flashlight around once I managed to get my bearings, my ears still ringing slightly from the impact of the fall, my whole body aching from landing hard on packed dirt. And it honestly looked like a room straight out of Texas Chainsaw Massacre itself. The exact same movie that had inspired this whole terrible idea in the first place. Old ropes hung from hooks along the dirt walls. Rusty chains lay coiled on the ground and draped across makeshift tables. Rusty hooks jutted out from wooden support beams at odd, deliberate heights. Saws, old and stained with something dark, I didn't let myself think too hard about in that moment. Sat neatly arranged alongside other tools I couldn't immediately identify, all of it placed with a kind of careful, deliberate order that felt far more unsettling than if it had simply been scattered around in chaos. I never took a second look at any of it beyond that first sweep of my flashlight beam, because my buddy was already screaming and yelling for us to get the fuck out of there, his voice cracking with a genuine panic that cut through whatever shock the rest of us were still processing from the fall itself. He started reaching down through the hole from above, extending his arms as far as he could, grabbing at hands and wrists to start hauling people back up out of that dirt room and into whatever relative safety the ground level offered, even surrounded as it was by an old crime scene we hadn't yet fully understood the significance of. Everyone got out all right, scrambling and climbing and being pulled up through that jagged opening in the earth, except for one guy who had landed awkwardly during the initial fall and hurt his ankle pretty badly in the process, bad enough that he couldn't put much weight on it at all once we got him back up to ground level. Two of the bigger guys in our group ended up carrying him between them the entire way back through the woods and across the river to where we'd left the cars parked on that gravel road, taking turns supporting his weight as best they could over the uneven, root-tangled ground. Everyone else stayed in a tight grouping as we made our way back through the trees, nobody willing to wander even a few steps away from the rest of the group after everything we'd just seen and experienced. I had my shotgun with me still, and given everything that had just happened, I took up the rear of our group, walking backwards through most of that mile-long trek back through the woods, keeping my eyes fixed on the darkness behind us the entire time. The safety was off, and I had never in my life been more genuinely ready to use that weapon if anything, or anyone, came walking up out of that darkness toward us. Nothing did, thankfully. Though the walk back felt considerably longer than the walk out had, every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves somewhere in the surrounding trees sending a fresh jolt of adrenaline through the whole group. We eventually made it back to the cars, loaded everyone in, including our injured friend who was gritting his teeth against the pain in his ankle the entire time, and drove home in a heavy, exhausted silence that felt like a stark contrast to the nervous excitement we'd all shared on the way out just a couple hours earlier. The next day, once the sun was properly up and the whole ordeal from the previous night had taken on that slightly less terrifying quality that daylight tends to bring to scary experiences, a couple of us decided to go back to the property, mostly out of a mixture of curiosity and disbelief, wanting to see the place again in daylight and maybe make some sense of what exactly we'd stumbled into the night before. As we pulled down that same gravel road, though, we found 3 cop cars parked along the side of it, lights off, but clearly stationed there for some official purpose. Officers moving around near the tree line where the path into the woods began. We pulled up alongside them and asked what was going on, trying to sound casual even though my stomach had already started twisting with a very specific kind of dread. Apparently, somebody, maybe a nearby farmer or someone else out that far from town, had heard us the night before. All the yelling and commotion from the fall and the panic that followed, and had called the police to report suspicious activity out near that old abandoned property. When the cops made their way back through the woods that morning to investigate, they found their way to the house and eventually discovered that hidden dirt room beneath it. The same one 6 of us had fallen straight into just hours earlier. It turned out, according to what the officers were willing to share with us that morning, that the house and that hidden underground room had apparently been used as some combination of a meth lab and a murder scene. Exactly the kind of horrifying discovery that made every single detail from the night before. The initials on the wall, the blood-stained wedding dress hanging in that first-floor window, the tools arranged so carefully in that dirt room suddenly feel a whole lot less like something we could rationalize away, and a whole lot more like something genuinely, deeply wrong that we had stumbled directly into the middle of without any idea what we were actually walking toward. I never heard too much more after that initial conversation with the officers on the gravel road. Small-town gossip filled in a few details here and there over the following weeks, though nothing ever felt fully confirmed or reliable, the kind of half-true rumors that spread through a place like ours whenever something genuinely disturbing happens close to home. And as far as I know, I don't think they ever actually found or identified the people who had been using that space. Whoever had cooked drugs down there, whoever was responsible for whatever had happened to leave that much blood soaked into a wedding dress hanging from the ceiling. I still get freaked out sometimes, even all these years later, when I think back on what could have happened if we had stumbled onto that house while the people actually running that operation were still there, still present in that hidden room beneath the mansion instead of wherever they happened to be that particular night. 10 teenagers, only one gun between us, and honestly not much real intention of using it beyond feeling a little safer walking through dark woods, wandering directly into what turned out to be an active meth lab and apparent murder scene, completely unaware of what we were actually walking toward until it was already far too late to turn back. The initials on that wall still don't have any explanation I've ever found satisfying, and neither does the exact meaning behind that wedding dress and the bloodstain across its front, though none of us have ever wanted to go back and try to find out more. I do have another story, too. One about waking up in the middle of the night to find a stranger standing at the foot of my bed. Someone who ended up stealing basically everything I owned worth taking before disappearing again into the dark, but that's a whole other long story for another time. One that still manages to unsettle me almost as much as that night in the woods behind the old mansion, even though it happened under a roof I actually trusted, in a house that was supposed to be safe. Looking back on that whole night now, years later, with plenty of distance and a lot more life experience than I had as a teenager, chasing a dumb idea straight out of a horror movie, I still find myself turning the details over in my mind, trying to make some kind of sense out of pieces that never really fit together into anything logical. The initials remain the part that bothers me most, honestly, more than the dress, more than the tools laid out so carefully in that dirt room beneath the house. A blood-stained wedding dress and a hidden room full of chains and rusty hooks, as horrifying as all of that was to actually see with my own eyes, at least made a certain grim sense once we learned what the property had actually been used for. But the initials, 10 sets matching exactly 10 teenagers who had never once set foot on that property before. Written on a wall that had clearly been there for a while before we ever arrived, that detail has never fit into any explanation I've been able to come up with, no matter how many times I've tried. I asked my buddy about it years later, the one whose idea it originally was to go check out the house that night, wondering if maybe he'd told other people about our group beforehand. Maybe somebody had gone out ahead of us and written those initials as some kind of elaborate prank meant to mess with us once we arrived. He swore up and down that he hadn't told anyone outside our immediate group, that as far as he knew, nobody else even knew the property existed, let alone knew who exactly would be part of our group that particular night. I believed him then, and I still believe him now. It simply doesn't add up as a prank. Not one so elaborate that it would require perfectly guessing the exact 10 people who would show up on a spur-of-the-moment decision made only a couple hours earlier that same evening after watching a movie. A few of us have gone back to that gravel road a couple of times over the years since then, though none of us have ever actually walked back into those woods again, not after everything that happened and everything we later learned about what that property had actually been used for. The road itself looks different now, a little more overgrown in places. The kind of quiet neglect that comes over places nobody bothers driving down anymore once the reason for going there stops existing. I don't know if the house is even still standing, whether the county eventually tore it down after the investigation wrapped up, or whether it's simply been left there to keep collapsing further in on itself, swallowed up more each year by the woods surrounding it, hiding whatever else might still be buried in that ground beneath it. Every couple of years, usually around Halloween, when old stories tend to resurface naturally over drinks with old friends, somebody in our old group will bring the whole thing up again, and we'll spend a while comparing memories, filling in details we'd each forgotten, arguing gently over small specifics that none of us seem to remember quite the same way anymore. But there's one thing every single one of us agrees on completely, without any disagreement at all. None of us have ever wanted to go back into those woods. Not during the day, not in a large group, not even out of simple curiosity about what might still be down in that dirt room beneath the collapsed mansion. Some places, once you've seen what we saw that night, simply aren't worth the risk of a second look, no matter how many years have passed since. and no matter how much safer daylight and distance might make it feel in theory. A few years ago, my wife started having night terrors, the kind of nightly episodes that eventually wear a person down completely, both physically and emotionally, no matter how strong or resilient they usually are. She would wake up every single night, without fail, with a black ooze-like blob figure standing directly over her in our bed, close enough that she could sense its presence looming right above her the instant she opened her eyes. She would freak out immediately, her whole body flooding with panic, until the figure sort of dissolved away on its own after a few terrifying seconds, fading back into the darkness of our bedroom as suddenly as it had appeared in the first place. She just thought it was typical brain randomness at first, some kind of ordinary sleep disturbance, the sort of thing that happens to plenty of people from time to time without any deeper meaning behind it, since she doesn't really believe in anything even quasi-paranormal to begin with. She's a very grounded, practical person by nature, not someone prone to jumping to supernatural explanations for things that could reasonably be explained by stress or exhaustion or some quirk of brain chemistry during sleep. And for the first while, that explanation seemed reasonable enough to both of us, an unpleasant but ultimately harmless glitch in her sleeping mind that would presumably work itself out eventually, once whatever stress or triggering factor behind it resolved on its own. I must confess, I typically don't believe in that sort of thing either. Not really. Not in any serious way. I've always considered myself a fairly rational person when it comes to the paranormal. The type who watches ghost hunting shows purely for entertainment rather than genuine belief, who assumes there's always some ordinary explanation lurking underneath even the strangest sounding stories other people tell. But after several months of this happening to my wife, night after night, with no sign of stopping or even lessening in intensity, I have to admit I was starting to consider other possibilities, even if just quietly, privately, without saying so directly to her at first. Normally, I'm pretty scared of the dark myself, if I'm being completely honest about it, which might sound a little embarrassing to admit as a grown adult. But it's the truth. Scary movies genuinely terrify me in a way that lingers long after the credits roll. I remember after I saw The Ring for the first time, years before any of this happened with my wife, I could barely sleep properly for days afterward, jumping at every small sound in the house, unable to look at a television screen in a dark room without my heart rate spiking a little. So the idea of intentionally confronting something potentially supernatural, something that had apparently been standing over my wife's side of our bed every single night for months, was not exactly a role I ever pictured myself stepping into. However, seeing my poor little wife scared and desperately sleep-deprived, watching the toll those months of interrupted, terror-filled nights had taken on her, the dark circles under her eyes, the exhaustion that had settled into every part of her daily life, my anger eventually overcame my typical fear of this kind of thing. There's a particular kind of protective fury that builds up in you when someone you love is suffering and you feel powerless to actually help them. And by that point, several months into this ordeal, that fury had built up in me to the point where it genuinely outweighed my own personal fear of the dark and everything associated with it. One night, after yet another rough evening where my wife had woken up gasping and shaking beside me, describing that same black shape looming over her yet again, I told her to switch sides of the bed with me. I don't know exactly what I expected to accomplish by doing that, whether I genuinely believed there was something specific about her particular side of the bed that was drawing this presence, or whether it was simply an instinctive gesture, a way of physically putting myself between whatever this was and the person I loved most. She didn't object to the switch, too exhausted at that point to argue or even really question my reasoning, and we settled into bed that night with our usual sides reversed for the first time since we'd moved into that bedroom together. As I lay there afterward, trying to fall asleep despite the nervous energy buzzing underneath my exhaustion, I sort of sent out a mental message, over and over and over again in my head, repeating the same defiant phrase like a kind of internal chant. Bring it, you son of a bitch. I just repeated that thought over and over in my mind, deliberately, almost aggressively, until I eventually drifted off to sleep somewhere in the middle of that repetition, the phrase still echoing faintly in my thoughts even as consciousness slipped away from me. At some point in the night, I woke up rapidly, snapping out of what had been a genuinely deep sleep, the kind of sudden, jarring wakefulness that leaves your heart already racing before your mind has fully caught up to why. And the reason for that abrupt awakening became immediately clear the moment my eyes opened, because something was standing directly over me, exactly the way my wife had described it happening to her for all those months previously. It was sort of human-shaped, but blobby, an approximate outline of a person rendered in something that wasn't solid the way an actual human body would be. Like a spill that somewhat resembles the outline of a person if you squint at it from a certain angle, dark and shapeless in its details, but unmistakably humanoid in its overall silhouette. Looming there above me in the darkness of our bedroom with a stillness that felt deeply, fundamentally wrong. I could just feel this yuck feeling radiating off of it, for lack of a better way to describe it. Not physical, not any kind of tangible sensation like cold or pressure, but more like an emotional disconnect coming from it. A wrongness that registered somewhere deeper than my ordinary five senses, an almost instinctive revulsion that I felt in my chest and stomach rather than on my skin. It's hard to properly put into words, even now, years later, trying to describe exactly what that feeling was like, except to say that every part of me recognized, immediately and without any doubt, that whatever was standing over me did not belong there, had no right to be there, and was fundamentally opposed to everything about our home and our life together in some way I couldn't fully articulate, even to myself in that moment. And I just snapped. It's difficult to explain exactly what happened next, the sequence of it, because I was still partially asleep, caught somewhere in that hazy space between full unconsciousness and complete wakefulness. And in that state, this abstract thought came to me and somehow made perfect, complete sense, the way things sometimes do in dreams that would seem strange or illogical once you're fully conscious. Again, I sort of mentally lashed out at it, pushing outward with everything I had, not physically, since my body remained mostly frozen and unmoving in that half-asleep state, but with something else entirely, some part of me I don't normally have conscious access to. I sent out a feeling, a clear and forceful message, directed straight at that shape, looming over me. Get the fuck out of my house and stay away from my wife, or I will end you. I was so angry all those months of accumulated stress and pain my wife had been forced to endure finally boiling over into this single, focused moment of pure defiance. And I felt so completely justified in that anger, so vengeful and certain of my own righteousness in that instant, that the force of it felt almost physical, radiating outward from me toward that dark shape with an intensity I have honestly never experienced before or since in any other context of my life. Then the shape sort of faded out, dissolving away the same way my wife had always described it doing to her, growing thinner and less defined until it simply wasn't there anymore. As I woke up, completely, fully alert now, my heart absolutely pounding in my chest, adrenaline flooding through my whole body. But strangely, despite everything that had just happened, despite the fact that I am ordinarily terrified by far less frightening things than what I had just directly confronted, I wasn't actually afraid in that moment. There was something almost calm underneath the adrenaline, a strange, settled feeling that came from having finally stood up to whatever this thing was. Whatever had been tormenting my wife for months on end, and having, at least in that moment, apparently won. I actually managed to get back to sleep pretty quickly after that, which surprises me even now looking back on it, given how thoroughly awake and alert I had felt in the immediate aftermath. But my body and mind seemed to settle almost as quickly as they had spiked, and within what felt like a fairly short amount of time, I drifted back off into a normal, dreamless sleep for the rest of that night. None of the racing thoughts or lingering fear that would normally keep me tossing and turning after something genuinely frightening happened to me. And that was the last night my wife ever had a night terror. Not a single episode since. Not one instance of her waking up to that black shape looming over her. Not one more sleepless, terrified night in all the time that has passed since that particular evening. It was probably about 2 years ago now, and in all that time, whatever had been visiting her every single night for those several difficult months simply never came back. Not to her side of the bed, not to mine, not anywhere in our house at all as far as either of us has been able to tell. It remains one of the weirdest events I have ever personally experienced in my entire life, and I still don't fully know what to make of it. Even now, with 2 years of distance and plenty of time to think it over from every possible rational angle I can come up with. Obviously, it's nothing conclusive on its own. I understand perfectly well how something like this could be explained away through ordinary means, some combination of shared stress, suggestion, the power of belief, and expectation shaping what two exhausted, anxious minds perceive in the darkness of a bedroom in the middle of the night. I'm not the kind of person who needs this to have been something genuinely supernatural in order to feel satisfied by the story. But it raises my eyebrow every single time I think about it. All these details lining up in a way that feels difficult to dismiss entirely, no matter how many rational explanations I try to layer on top of it afterward. My wife and I have talked about that night many times since it happened, comparing our separate experiences of that same shape, that same dissolving presence, trying to figure out together what it actually was, and why it seemed to stop entirely the moment I confronted it directly, instead of simply witnessing it happen to her from the sidelines. She still maintains, mostly, that it was probably some kind of shared sleep disorder or stress-related phenomenon, something our minds cooked up together during an especially difficult period in our lives, though even she admits the timing of it all, ending so abruptly and completely on the exact night I switched sides with her and mentally confronted whatever it was. Feels a little too convenient to be pure coincidence. I don't know what I actually saw that night, or what I actually did to make it stop, if I even really did anything at all beyond simply having an intense emotional reaction during a particularly vivid nightmare. I've turned it over in my mind more times than I could possibly count over these past 2 years, trying to reconcile my usual skepticism about anything paranormal with the very real, very specific memory of that shape looming over me, and the very real, very complete end to my wife's suffering that followed immediately afterward. Every explanation I try to land on eventually runs into some detail that doesn't quite fit cleanly, some piece of the story that resists being fully explained away by ordinary logic alone. What I do know with complete certainty is what it felt like in that exact moment, lying there half asleep with that dark shape standing directly over me, feeling that strange, wrong sensation radiating off it, and feeling my own fear transform almost instantly into something fiercer and more protective than anything I had ever experienced before. Whatever that thing actually was, whatever explanation eventually turns out to be the true one, if such an explanation even exists, I know that in that particular moment, I meant every single word of what I sent out toward it. and I have never for a second regretted the fury I felt in defending my wife, real threat or not. These days, my wife sleeps peacefully every single night, the way she used to before all of this started, before those months of exhausting, terrifying interruptions took such a visible toll on her. We don't talk about that period as often as we used to, mostly because there simply isn't much new to say about it anymore. The story having been told and retold between us enough times that it's settled into its own permanent shape in our shared history together. But every once in a while, usually late at night when the house is quiet and we're both lying in bed before sleep fully takes over, one of us will bring it up again, almost as a kind of ritual, checking in with each other about whether anything strange has happened recently, whether either of us has felt that particular yuck feeling return in any form. The answer has always been no, every single time we've asked. Whatever it was, it has stayed away completely in the 2 years since that night. And I would like to believe, whether it's entirely true or not, that it stays away because it knows exactly what will happen if it ever decides to come back. Looking back on the whole ordeal now, with a couple of years of distance and a lot of time to sit with everything that happened, I find myself thinking about the details my wife described from those earlier months, more than I probably should. Turning them over in my mind, trying to find some pattern or explanation I might have missed the first time around. She always described the timing of these episodes as remarkably consistent, always happening somewhere in that deep stretch of night, between roughly 2 and 4 in the morning. Never earlier in the evening when we'd first fall asleep. Never close to dawn when our alarm was about to go off. There was a regularity to it that never sat quite right with either of us, even when we were trying our hardest to explain it away as some ordinary sleep disturbance. I also think a lot about how she described the shape itself changing subtly over those months, something she only really articulated clearly to me after the fact. Once it had already stopped happening, and she felt comfortable enough to talk about it in more detail than she had, while it was actively terrifying her every single night. In the earliest instances, she said, the shape seemed smaller, less defined, almost hesitant in the way it hovered over her, gone again within just a second or two of her eyes opening. But as the months wore on, she said it seemed to grow bolder somehow, staying visible longer before dissolving, seeming to loom closer to her face each time, as if it were testing some boundary, gradually pushing further each night to see how much it could get away with before she reacted strongly enough to make it retreat. That detail bothers me more than almost anything else about the whole experience, honestly, because it suggests something with intention behind it, something capable of adjusting its own behavior based on her reactions over time, rather than some fixed, mechanical glitch in her sleeping brain that would presumably behave the same way every single time, regardless of how she responded to it. A purely psychological explanation, some quirk of sleep paralysis or an anxiety-related hallucination, doesn't easily account for that kind of gradual escalation. At least not in any way I've been able to fully satisfy myself with when I really sit and think it through carefully. I've done a fair amount of reading since then, mostly out of my own curiosity rather than any genuine belief that I would find a clean answer, looking into sleep paralysis and the various shadow figure experiences that apparently a surprising number of people report having at some point in their lives, often described in remarkably similar terms to what my wife went through. There does seem to be a fairly well-documented phenomenon along these lines, a kind of hallucinated presence that shows up during that strange transitional state between sleep and wakefulness, frequently described as a dark, human-shaped figure standing near the bed. Reading through other people's accounts of this experience was oddly comforting in a way. Knowing we weren't the only ones who had ever gone through something like it, though none of the explanations I found ever fully addressed the part of our experience that troubled me most, the fact that it stopped completely and permanently vividly the exact night I deliberately confronted it. My wife has her own theory about that part, one she's mentioned to me a few times over the past couple of years, usually somewhat sheepishly, since it doesn't fit particularly well with her generally skeptical worldview. She thinks that maybe it was never really about the room or the bed or any specific location at all, but about her, specifically. Something that had somehow latched on to her personally during an especially stressful period in her life, work-related stress mostly. A difficult stretch at her job that had been weighing heavily on her mind around the time all of this started. And she thinks that maybe switching places with me that night, having someone else occupy that same physical space in the bed, someone in a completely different emotional state, angry and protective rather than anxious and exhausted the way she had been for months, somehow disrupted whatever pattern had been sustaining it. I don't know if I fully buy that explanation either, if I'm being honest, but it's as good a theory as any I've come across, and it has the added benefit of at least partially explaining why the confrontation seemed to matter so much. Why simply switching beds without that internal, furious message I sent out might not have been enough on its own to actually end it. Maybe it needed to encounter something it hadn't expected, some kind of resistance, rather than the fear it had presumably been feeding on or drawn to during all those previous months with my wife. Whatever the real explanation turns out to be, assuming there even is a single clean explanation waiting to be found, I've mostly made peace with not knowing for certain. My wife sleeps soundly now, has for 2 full years running, and that outcome matters far more to me than any theoretical understanding of what exactly that shape was, or why it targeted her in the first place. I still think about that feeling sometimes, though, that particular yuck sensation radiating off it. Unlike anything I've felt before or since, and I still wonder, on quiet nights when my mind wanders toward it unprompted, whether it's really gone for good, or whether it's simply waiting somewhere out there, patient, for another opportunity to try again. There's one more small detail I've never really shared with anyone outside my wife, mostly because it sounds even stranger than everything else I've already described, and because I genuinely don't know what to make of it myself. A few weeks after that night, maybe a month or so later, I woke up in the very early morning, well before my alarm, with a strange, lingering sense that I had been dreaming about that same shape again, though I couldn't recall any specific images or details from the dream itself, just a vague impression that it had been there somehow, on the edges of my sleeping mind, watching rather than approaching. I didn't mention it to my wife at the time, not wanting to worry her or risk somehow bringing the whole ordeal back to the front of her mind after she'd finally started sleeping peacefully again. It never happened again after that single instance, as far as I can remember, but I've always wondered if it meant something. Some final farewell glance before whatever it was retreated completely, or simply my own anxious mind processing the lingering trauma of those months in its own way. We've since moved to a different house, for entirely unrelated reasons having to do with my wife's job and wanting a bit more space, and I'll admit there was a small, quiet part of me that felt relieved about that move, for reasons that had nothing to do with square footage or commute times. Our new bedroom looks nothing like the old one. Different layout, different windows, different feel entirely, and my wife sleeps just as soundly here as she has for the past 2 years running. I don't know if leaving that old house mattered at all in any real sense, whether whatever we encountered was somehow tied to that specific location or simply tied to us as people, regardless of where we happen to be living. But I'll admit that some part of me feels a little more at ease knowing we're not sleeping in that same room anymore, in that same bed, on those same sides we eventually settled back into once the whole ordeal had ended and normal life resumed. My wife still brings it up occasionally, usually with a kind of amused, slightly embarrassed tone, joking about her husband apparently scaring off a ghost through sheer stubbornness and anger alone, and I always laugh along with her when she puts it that way. Because honestly, framed like that, it does sound a little absurd even to me, even having lived through it myself. But there's always a small pause after the laughter fades, a moment where neither of us quite says out loud what we're both thinking, that whatever actually happened that night, ordinary or otherwise, it worked. And neither of us has any real interest in testing whether it might come back if we ever let our guard down again. Every so often, late at night when I can't quite fall asleep, I find myself thinking back to that exact moment. That shape looming over me. That strange yuck feeling. And the fury that rose up in me before I even had time to be properly afraid. I don't fully understand what happened that night. And I'm not sure I ever will. But I know it worked. And for now, that's enough for me. My wife is asleep beside me most nights without a single interruption now, breathing steady and calm the way she used to before any of this ever began. And whatever else remains unexplained about that whole strange chapter of our lives, that peace is the part I hold on to the tightest.